The tale of Atlantis doesn't start deep under the ocean or from digging up old things. It begins in the schools of ancient Athens around 360 BC. Inside the beautiful columns of a special school, a thinker named Plato wrote two stories that would make people wonder, argue, and search for answers for hundreds of years. These writings, called the Timaeus and Critias, are the only old records we have of what became one of history's biggest mysteries. Plato's story comes through a character named Critias, based on his great-grandfather. Critias says he learned the story through people telling it over time, going back to a famous Athenian leader named Solon. The story says that Solon traveled to Egypt around 590 BC. There, Egyptian priests in the city of Sais told him about ancient records of a powerful civilization that lived 9,000 years before them. The priests, who kept temple records that supposedly went back thousands of years, talked about a strong island nation that once threatened the known world before sinking under the waves in just one day and night. The Timaeus story mainly introduces the Atlantis tale, setting it up as a beginning to Plato's talk about the perfect government and universe. Here, Critias quickly explains the basic idea. Ancient Athens was once the perfect example of a great city, successfully protecting the Mediterranean world against the attacking Atlantis Empire. This early version shows the main conflict between the good, well-organized Athenian state and the bad, power-hungry Atlantean Empire. The Critias story, though never finished, gives the detailed picture of Atlantis that has amazed people for over 2,000 years. Plato describes an island bigger than Libya and Asia together, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. This location put Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, in waters that were supposedly impossible to sail through after the island sank because of shallow mud left by the disaster. The description of Atlantis shows a civilization with amazing skill and riches. The island had alternating rings of land and water, with the center island measuring about 50 stadia across, roughly 5.7 miles. These circular rings were connected by tunnels big enough for ships to pass through, making a complicated system of harbors and waterways. The outermost water ring worked as a huge harbor that could hold vast fleets of warships and trading vessels. The capital city's buildings showed both military planning and flashy displays of wealth. Huge walls surrounded each ring. The outer wall was covered in brass, the middle wall was coated in tin, and the innermost wall shined with orichalcum, a mysterious metal that Plato says was second in value only to gold. These metal-covered walls would have made a dazzling sight, reflecting sunlight across the harbor and visible from far away at sea. At the center of the city stood the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon, the protector god of Atlantis. This temple, measuring 600 feet long, 300 feet wide, and very tall, was built entirely of silver except for its golden tops. Inside, a giant gold statue of Poseidon driving six-winged horses filled the space, reaching almost to the ceiling. The temple grounds had golden statues of the 10 original Atlantean kings and their wives, creating a display of royal power frozen in precious metal. The Atlantean society that Plato describes worked under a unique government system, mixing parts of monarchy, aristocracy, and federalism. 10 kings, all children of Atlas, the firstborn son of Poseidon, ruled different parts of the island and its outside territories. These rulers met every 5th and 6th year to talk about common problems and to judge any breaking of their sacred laws, which were written on a pillar of orichalcum inside the temple. The military strength of Atlantis showed its huge resources and population. Plato gives specific numbers. The island could field 60,000 leaders of soldiers, 120,000 heavy infantry, 180,000 archers, 180,000 slingers, 300,000 stone shooters and javelin throwers, 240,000 horsemen, and 60,000 chariots. The naval forces included 1,200 ships, each carrying 200 men. These numbers suggest a total military force of over 1 million men, supported by a civilian population that must have been in the tens of millions. The money foundation of this military machine rested on the island's amazing natural wealth. The fertile plains grew 2 harvests every year, watered by winter rains and summer watering from a fancy canal system. The main canal, 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and 1,125 miles long, connected the capital to the sea, while smaller channels created a grid pattern across the flat plain, helping both watering and transportation. This farming success supported not only the huge population, but also big trade networks that brought unusual goods from across the known world. The technology achievements of Atlantis went beyond farming and buildings. Plato described clever engineering projects including the digging of harbors, the building of bridges across the water rings, and the making of underground passages for ships. The Atlanteans worked with advanced metalworking, using not only regular metals, but also the mysterious orichalcum, which they dug from the earth in many parts of the island. Yet beneath this surface of wealth and power, Plato weaves a story of moral decline that serves as the main philosophical point of his account. At first, the Atlanteans showed virtue and wisdom. Their divine heritage from Poseidon showed in just government and noble character. However, as time passed and the divine part in their nature became weaker through marriage with regular people, their character slowly got worse. They became obsessed with material wealth, political ambition, and empire building. This change from virtue to corruption represents the central moral lesson of Plato's story. The early Atlanteans, like the ideal citizens of Plato's Republic, had the important virtues of wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. Their society worked well because each person fulfilled their proper role according to their nature and abilities. The later Atlanteans, by contrast, showed the dangers of unchecked democracy and material excess that Plato saw in his own Athens. The timeline Plato gives for these events places the Atlantis story about 9,600 years before his own time, around 9,500 BC. This dating puts the story right after the last ice age, a time when sea levels were indeed rising and coastal civilizations might have faced terrible flooding. However, the 9,000-year gap also conveniently places the events beyond any way to check the facts in his time, giving the account an air of ancient truth while preventing factual challenges. The location beyond the Pillars of Hercules also serves multiple story purposes. This placement removes Atlantis from the familiar Mediterranean world while making it a real threat to the civilizations Plato's audience knew. The Atlantic Ocean represented the edge of the known world, a realm of mystery where amazing civilizations might believably have existed. The later impossibility of sailing these waters due to mud provides a convenient explanation for why no explorers had rediscovered the lost continent. The question of Plato's purpose in creating the Atlantis story has created scholarly debate for centuries. Several factors suggest that Plato thought of Atlantis mainly as a philosophical lesson rather than historical fact. The account appears only in Plato's works, with no supporting evidence from other ancient sources who would have had access to the same Egyptian records. The detailed number specifications, from military forces to building dimensions, display the careful precision typical of Plato's theoretical ideas rather than the rough estimates typical of historical accounts. Furthermore, the Atlantis story serves specific teaching and political purposes within the bigger context of Plato's work. The contrast between good ancient Athens and corrupt Atlantis mirrors the difference between the ideal state described in the Republic and the bad democracies Plato criticized in his own Greece. The repeating rise and fall of civilizations reflected Plato's theories about political change and the unavoidable corruption of even the best-ordered states over time. The teaching purpose of the Atlantis story also supports reading it as a lesson. Plato often used myths and stories to show abstract philosophical ideas, making complex thoughts easier to understand through concrete imagery. The tale of Atlantis provides a vivid example of how material wealth and military power separated from virtue and wisdom inevitably lead to moral corruption and final destruction. This lesson was particularly important for Plato's audience, who had witnessed Athens change from the defender of Greek freedom against Persian invasion to an aggressive empire whose overreach had led to defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The specific details of Atlantean society often mirror and criticize aspects of Athenian civilization during its empire period. The huge naval forces, the tribute-paying subject territories, the magnificent public buildings funded by empire wealth, and the slow wearing away of traditional values all reflected patterns that Plato's audience would have recognized from their own recent history. The terrible end of Atlantis served as a warning about the possible results of empire pride and moral decline. Yet the possibility remains that Plato drew inspiration from actual historical events or civilizations, even while crafting a mainly lesson-based story. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC had seen the sudden disappearance of several advanced civilizations, including the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittite Empire. Memories of these disasters might have survived in oral traditions, providing a historical foundation for Plato's fictional elaboration. The time right after Plato's death in 347 BC marked the beginning of a complex thinking legacy regarding his Atlantis story. Within the halls of the Academy and the Lyceum, Plato's most famous students wrestled with the philosophical and historical meaning of their master's account. None proved more influential in shaping later interpretations than Aristotle, whose clear dismissal of Atlantis as historical fact would echo through centuries of scholarly discussion. Aristotle's position on Atlantis came from his broader criticism of Plato's philosophical methods. As the most systematic and evidence-minded of Plato's students, Aristotle had a sharp sensitivity to the difference between philosophical lessons and historical stories. His famous statement that "the man who dreamed it up made it vanish" represented more than casual doubt. It reflected a basic disagreement about the proper relationship between philosophical teaching and factual accuracy. This clear dismissal, preserved in later sources, became the earliest recorded example of scholarly doubt toward the Atlantis account. The philosophical context surrounding Aristotle's rejection reveals deeper tensions within the Academy itself. Where Plato used myth and allegory as vehicles for abstract truths, Aristotle increasingly favored direct logical argument and real-world observation. The Atlantis story, with its precise numerical details and elaborate geographical descriptions, presented exactly the kind of fictional framework disguised as historical fact that Aristotle found methodologically problematic. His criticism targeted not merely the content of the story, but Plato's entire approach to philosophical teaching. Other immediate followers of Plato took more nuanced positions. Crantor of Soli, who studied directly under Xenocrates in the early 3rd century BC, represented the first known attempt to defend the historical truth of the Atlantis account. His commentary on the Timaeus, fragments of which survive in later Neoplatonic sources, argued that Plato had indeed based his story on genuine Egyptian records. Crantor claimed to have checked the existence of these records during his own travels, though the specific nature of his evidence remains unclear from surviving fragments. The absence of Atlantis references in other historical works from that time presents one of the most convincing arguments for Aristotle's position. Herodotus, writing his histories in the mid-5th century BC, showed exhaustive curiosity about distant lands and ancient civilizations. His accounts cover regions from Scythia to Ethiopia, including local traditions, religious practices, and historical memories spanning centuries. Yet nowhere in his comprehensive survey of the Mediterranean world and its edges does Herodotus mention any tradition resembling the Atlantis story, despite his documented fascination with Egyptian wisdom and historical records. Similarly, Thucydides, whose history of the Peloponnesian War established new standards for historical accuracy and source criticism, makes no reference to any ancient Athenian victory over a Western maritime empire. Given Thucydides' careful attention to Athenian historical traditions and his pride in documenting the city's past achievements, this omission carries particular weight. His account of early Greek history, though brief, includes references to various ancient conflicts and migrations that would have provided natural contexts for mentioning the Atlantis War if such traditions had existed. The geographic writings of Strabo, composed during the early Roman Empire, provide perhaps the most systematic ancient critique of the Atlantis story. Writing around the time of Augustus, Strabo had access to extensive geographical literature from the Hellenistic period, including works by explorers who had ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic Ocean. His dismissal of Atlantis as Plato's invention carried the weight of comprehensive geographical knowledge unavailable to earlier critics. Strabo's analysis focused particularly on the practical impossibilities of Plato's geographical claims. The claim that Atlantis had been larger than Libya and Asia combined struck him as basically incompatible with what Hellenistic explorers had discovered about the Atlantic Ocean's size and character. Furthermore, Strabo noted that Plato's claim about impossible mud preventing later exploration contradicted the experiences of sailors of his time who had successfully sailed Atlantic waters. His geographical expertise lent scientific credibility to philosophical doubt about the account's historical accuracy. The Roman historical tradition similarly ignored the Atlantis story despite extensive engagement with Greek philosophical and historical sources. Livy's huge work incorporated numerous Greek historical traditions and legends, yet makes no reference to Atlantis despite covering periods when such a story might have provided useful comparison material. Tacitus, famous for his critical approach to sources and his interest in the relationship between geography and political power, likewise omits any mention of the lost civilization, despite his detailed discussions of distant lands and peoples. This pattern of absence becomes particularly significant when contrasted with the Roman treatment of other Platonic ideas. Roman intellectuals readily adopted and adapted Plato's political theories, educational philosophy, and metaphysical concepts. Yet the Atlantis story failed to gain traction in Roman historical or geographical literature, suggesting that educated Romans recognized its fictional character even when they embraced other aspects of Platonic thought. The rise of Neoplatonism during late antiquity marked a dramatic shift in how people received the Atlantis story. Beginning with Plotinus in the 3rd century AD and reaching full development under Proclus in the 5th century, Neoplatonic philosophers approached Plato's works with a fundamentally different interpretive framework than their classical predecessors. Rather than viewing the dialogues primarily as philosophical arguments or historical accounts, they understood them as complex systems of lessons encoding deep metaphysical truths. Proclus, writing his extensive commentary on the Timaeus around 440 AD, devoted considerable attention to defending both the historical accuracy and hidden meaning of the Atlantis account. His approach reflected the Neoplatonic belief that Plato's writings operated at multiple levels of meaning at the same time. According to Proclus, the surface story of Atlantis described actual historical events, while the deeper hidden structure revealed truths about the cosmic order and the soul's relationship to material existence. The Neoplatonic defense of Atlantis's historicity rested partly on religious arguments about divine providence and partly on elaborate theories about the relationship between time and eternity. Proclus argued that the Egyptian priests mentioned by Plato had genuine access to ancient records because their religious traditions maintained unbroken continuity with ancient wisdom. This continuity, guaranteed by divine providence, ensured the preservation of historical truth across thousands of years, despite the general tendency toward cultural decline and forgetfulness. More significantly, Proclus developed sophisticated hidden interpretations that transformed the Atlantis story into a cosmic drama. In his reading, the conflict between Athens and Atlantis represented the eternal struggle between intellectual and material principles within both the cosmos and the individual soul. Ancient Athens embodied the philosophical life oriented toward eternal truths, while Atlantis symbolized the material world's tempting power and ultimate instability. The destruction of Atlantis thus showed the unavoidable fate of any civilization that prioritized material wealth over spiritual wisdom. These hidden interpretations allowed Neoplatonic philosophers to embrace the Atlantis story without confronting the historical and geographical difficulties that had troubled earlier critics. By locating the story's primary importance in its symbolic rather than literal content, they could at the same time affirm its truth and acknowledge its apparent incompatibility with known historical facts. This interpretive strategy proved influential among later medieval and Renaissance readers who inherited Neoplatonic approaches to Platonic texts. The encounter between the Atlantis story and early Christian thought produced complex and varied responses that reflected broader tensions between classical learning and biblical authority. Early Christian writers faced the challenge of combining Greek philosophical wisdom with revealed truth while maintaining the priority of scriptural chronology and historical framework. The Atlantis story presented particular difficulties because its ancient dating appeared to conflict with biblical accounts of human history and divine providence. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 AD, demonstrated the sophisticated approach that characterized Alexandrian Christian scholarship. Rather than rejecting the Atlantis story outright, Clement tried to harmonize it with Christian historical understanding through careful chronological analysis. He argued that the Egyptian dating systems underlying Plato's account suffered from systematic errors that made ancient events appear far more remote than they actually were. By adjusting these timelines to match biblical timelines, Clement suggested that the Atlantis story might refer to events happening within the framework of sacred history. Augustine of Hippo adopted a more skeptical stance that reflected his broader concerns about the relationship between classical learning and Christian faith. In his City of God, Augustine acknowledged the philosophical value of Platonic thought while maintaining critical distance from specific historical claims that lacked scriptural support. His treatment of Atlantis showed this balanced approach, recognizing the story's hidden lesson potential while expressing doubt about its literal accuracy. The chronological problems posed by the Atlantis story became increasingly serious as Christian scholars developed more systematic approaches to universal history. The traditional dating of Atlantis to approximately 9,500 BC created obvious conflicts with biblical timelines that placed human creation only a few thousand years before the Christian era. Some Christian writers attempted to resolve this difficulty by arguing that Plato had misunderstood the Egyptian chronological systems, while others suggested that the story referred to pre-flood civilizations mentioned indirectly in Genesis. Eastern Christian writers, particularly those working within the Byzantine tradition, often proved more open to the Atlantis story than their Western counterparts. The Byzantine scholarly tradition maintained closer continuity with classical Greek learning and showed greater willingness to integrate non-biblical historical traditions into comprehensive historical frameworks. Some Byzantine chronographers attempted to work the Atlantis story into their universal histories by identifying it with various biblical or post-biblical events. The patristic treatment of Atlantis also reflected broader religious concerns about divine justice and the fate of civilizations. Many Christian writers found in the destruction of Atlantis a powerful example of divine judgment against human pride and corruption. This religious interpretation allowed them to embrace the story's moral message while remaining unsure about its historical accuracy. The story's emphasis on the gradual moral decline of initially good people resonated strongly with Christian understandings of human nature and the consequences of sin. The preservation and transmission of classical texts during the early medieval period significantly influenced later reception of the Atlantis story. As European scholars gradually recovered access to complete versions of Plato's dialogues, they encountered the story within its original philosophical context rather than through the filtered interpretations of earlier commentators. This direct engagement with Plato's text would prove crucial for later medieval and Renaissance developments in Atlantis interpretation. The collapse of classical learning institutions across Western Europe during the 5th and 6th centuries created an intellectual vacuum that profoundly affected the transmission of Platonic texts. As barbarian invasions disrupted trade networks and urban centers, the elaborate manuscript copying operations that had sustained classical literature for centuries began to fall apart. Monastic scriptoriums, while preserving essential Christian texts, operated with severely limited resources and necessarily selective copying priorities. In this environment of intellectual triage, the complete works of Plato, including the dialogues containing the Atlantis story, effectively vanished from Western European libraries. The practical challenges facing medieval scholars extended far beyond simple manuscript availability. The Timaeus and Critias dialogues required not only Greek language skill, but also familiarity with complex philosophical concepts and classical geographical knowledge that had largely disappeared from European intellectual culture. Even when fragments of Platonic texts survived in monastic collections, they often existed as isolated passages divorced from their original context, making comprehensive interpretation nearly impossible. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries, despite its significant achievements in preserving and copying classical texts, failed to recover the complete Platonic collection. Charlemagne's scholars, working primarily from Latin sources, had access to only limited portions of Plato's work through intermediary sources like Cicero's translations and Augustinian commentaries. The Timaeus existed in partial Latin translation through Chalcidius's 4th century version. But this translation ended abruptly at the point where Plato begins his detailed description of Atlantis, leaving medieval readers without access to the complete story. This textual gap created a peculiar situation where educated Europeans had theoretical knowledge about Plato's philosophical importance, while remaining largely ignorant of his specific teachings. Medieval encyclopedists like Isidore of Seville acknowledged Plato's significance in their comprehensive surveys of classical learning, yet their discussions necessarily relied on second-hand summaries rather than direct textual engagement. The Atlantis story, requiring access to the complete Timaeus and Critias dialogues, remained effectively unknown to medieval scholarship. The few references to lost civilizations that appeared in medieval literature typically came from biblical or patristic sources rather than classical Greek philosophy. Medieval chroniclers showed considerable interest in pre-flood history and the fate of pre-Christian civilizations, but their investigations drew primarily from Genesis, the Book of Enoch, and early Christian historical works. When medieval writers speculated about ancient catastrophes or vanished peoples, they framed their discussions within biblical chronology and theological interpretation rather than Platonic philosophy. The scholastic movement of the 12th and 13th centuries, despite its sophisticated engagement with classical philosophical texts, continued to lack access to the complete Platonic collection. Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica demonstrated remarkable familiarity with Aristotelian philosophy, made only passing references to Platonic ideas and showed no knowledge of the Atlantis story. This absence becomes particularly significant given Aquinas's comprehensive approach to integrating classical philosophy with Christian doctrine. Had he had access to the complete Platonic texts, the Atlantis story would likely have received theological analysis similar to his treatment of other classical materials. The translation movement centered in medieval Spain, which brought numerous Arabic philosophical texts into Latin, also failed to recover the missing Platonic dialogues. Islamic scholars had preserved extensive Aristotelian materials and developed sophisticated commentaries on Greek philosophical works, but their libraries apparently lacked complete versions of the Timaeus and Critias. This absence suggests that the textual loss had occurred early enough to affect both Christian and Islamic manuscript traditions, pointing to disruptions in the immediate post-classical period rather than later medieval developments. Byzantine scholars maintained better access to Greek philosophical texts throughout the medieval period, yet even their libraries appear to have suffered significant losses in Platonic materials. While Constantinople scriptoriums preserved many classical works that disappeared from Western Europe, references to Atlantis remain notably absent from Byzantine historical and geographical literature. This pattern suggests that the textual disruption affected Greek-speaking regions as well as Latin Europe, indicating widespread damage to the manuscript tradition during the early medieval transition. The absence of Atlantis references in medieval literature becomes particularly striking when contrasted with the period's fascination with geographical speculation and legendary lands. Medieval writers displayed intense curiosity about distant regions, mythical islands, and lost civilizations, producing elaborate accounts of places like the earthly paradise, the kingdom of Prester John, and various Atlantic islands reported by sailors. The intellectual appetite clearly existed for stories like the Atlantis account, yet the specific Platonic account remained unavailable to satisfy this curiosity. The Renaissance transformation of European intellectual culture began with the gradual recovery of classical Greek texts through contact with Byzantine scholars and the systematic exploration of monastic libraries. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 accelerated this process by forcing Greek scholars westward, carrying with them manuscript collections that had survived in Eastern libraries. Among these recovered texts were complete versions of Plato's dialogues, including the Timaeus and Critias that contain the full Atlantis story. Marsilio Ficino's monumental Latin translation of Plato's complete works, completed in Florence around 1484, marked the decisive moment in the Atlantis story's return to European consciousness. Ficino, working under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, approached his translation project with both scholarly rigor and philosophical enthusiasm that reflected the broader Renaissance engagement with classical antiquity. His translation made Platonic texts accessible to educated Europeans for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, creating the foundation for renewed scholarly engagement with the Atlantis story. Ficino's interpretive approach to the Atlantis story reflected his deep commitment to Neoplatonic philosophy and his belief in the fundamental compatibility between Platonic wisdom and Christian truth. Rather than viewing the story as either pure fiction or literal history, Ficino understood it as a complex lesson framework that encoded deep truths about human nature and divine providence. His commentary emphasized the moral dimensions of the story, interpreting the rise and fall of Atlantis as an illustration of the eternal conflict between spiritual and material values. The Medici court's intellectual environment proved particularly open to the Atlantis story's themes of lost wisdom and ancient greatness. Renaissance humanists, keenly aware of their own civilization's relationship to classical antiquity, found in the Atlantis story a powerful metaphor for the recovery and loss of cultural achievement. The parallel between their own efforts to recover classical learning and Plato's account of ancient wisdom preserved in Egyptian temples resonated strongly with humanist sensibilities. Pico della Mirandola's engagement with the Atlantis story showed the Renaissance synthesis of classical philosophy, Christian theology, and esoteric wisdom traditions. His oration on the dignity of man reflected the same confidence in human potential that characterized Plato's description of early Atlantean civilization, while his warnings about the dangers of material excess echoed the moral decline that Plato attributed to later Atlantean generations. This thematic convergence helped establish the Atlantis story as a central reference point for Renaissance discussions about human nature and civilizational development. The printing revolution of the late 15th century dramatically expanded access to Ficino's Platonic translations, ensuring that the Atlantis story reached scholarly audiences throughout Europe. The 1491 Venetian edition of Ficino's translation, produced by Aldus Manutius, showed the new technology's capacity to spread classical texts with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Within decades, educated Europeans from London to Prague had access to complete versions of the Timaeus and Critias, ending the 1,000-year-long absence of the Atlantis story from European intellectual discussion. The rediscovery of the Atlantis story happened at the same time as the age of exploration's dramatic expansion of geographical knowledge, creating unprecedented opportunities for new interpretations of Plato's account. Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic Ocean, beginning in 1492, occurred within a decade of Ficino's translation project, establishing a remarkable chronological convergence between textual recovery and geographical exploration. This timing proved crucial for later interpretations of the Atlantis story, as European scholars suddenly had both access to Plato's complete account and contemporary evidence of previously unknown lands beyond the Atlantic. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire provided particularly compelling material for Atlantis speculation. Hernán Cortés's letters describing Tenochtitlan's sophisticated urban planning, elaborate water management systems, and vast wealth immediately reminded educated Europeans of Plato's description of the Atlantean capital. The city's location on an island connected to the mainland by causeways, its complex system of canals and harbors, and its impressive architectural achievements all seem to echo specific details from the Critias dialogue. Francisco López de Gamarra's Historia General de las Indias, published in 1552, made clear connections between the newly discovered American civilizations and Plato's Atlantis story. López de Gamarra argued that the advanced indigenous cultures encountered by Spanish conquistadors provided concrete evidence that sophisticated civilizations had indeed existed in the Atlantic region, lending credibility to Plato's account. His interpretation suggested that the Atlantis story preserved genuine historical memories of pre-Columbian American civilizations, transmitted through Egyptian records and ultimately recorded by Plato. The geographical location of the Americas relative to the Mediterranean world also seemed to support Platonic accuracy. The positioning of the New World beyond the Strait of Gibraltar corresponded precisely to Plato's description of Atlantis as lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The vast size of the American continents matched Plato's claim that Atlantis had been larger than Libya and Asia combined, while the Atlantic Ocean's size provided ample space for the additional territories that Plato attributed to Atlantean control. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo's Historia General de las Indias offered a more systematic analysis of parallels between Platonic descriptions and American realities. Oviedo, who spent decades in the New World documenting indigenous cultures and natural phenomena, identified numerous specific correspondences between Plato's account and observed American characteristics. He noted similarities in agricultural techniques, architectural styles, and metalworking practices that suggested possible historical connections between Plato's Atlantis and pre-Columbian civilizations. The discovery of advanced hydraulic engineering in various American cultures provided particularly striking parallels to Plato's description of Atlantean water management. The elaborate canal systems of the Aztec capital, the sophisticated irrigation networks of Andean civilizations, and the complex harbor facilities found at various coastal sites all demonstrated engineering capabilities that matched or exceeded those attributed to Atlantis. These technological parallels suggested to Renaissance observers that American civilizations possessed the advanced knowledge that would have been necessary to construct the elaborate infrastructure described in the Critias dialogue. José de Acosta's Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias, published in 1590, attempted to provide a comprehensive framework for understanding the relationship between classical accounts of lost civilizations and contemporary American discoveries. Acosta argued that the Americas had been populated by successive waves of migration from the Old World, some of which might have carried memories of ancient civilizations that ultimately influenced indigenous American cultures. This migration theory provided a mechanism for explaining apparent parallels between Platonic descriptions and American realities, without requiring direct historical continuity. The chronological difficulties posed by Plato's dating of Atlantis to approximately 9,500 BC created significant challenges for scholars attempting to connect the story with known American civilizations. Renaissance chronographers, working within biblical frameworks that placed human creation only a few thousand years before the Christian era, struggled to accommodate Plato's ancient dating while maintaining the historical accuracy of scriptural accounts. Some scholars resolved this difficulty by arguing that Plato had misunderstood Egyptian chronological systems, while others suggested that the story referred to more recent events that had been artificially made older through oral transmission. The linguistic evidence presented by American discoveries also influenced Renaissance interpretations of the Atlantis story. Early ethnographers noted apparent similarities between certain American languages and Old World linguistic families, suggesting possible historical connections that might support Platonic claims about ancient Atlantic civilizations. While these linguistic parallels later proved largely false, they provided contemporary scholars with additional evidence for treating the Atlantis story as historically grounded rather than purely fictional. The intellectual excitement of the 17th and 18th centuries transformed European approaches to ancient texts and historical claims with unprecedented rigor. The scientific revolution's emphasis on observation and systematic methods created new frameworks for evaluating historical stories, while expanding geographical knowledge provided fresh contexts for interpreting ancient accounts of distant lands. Within this transformed intellectual landscape, the Atlantis story encountered both vigorous scholarly investigation and increasingly sophisticated criticism, as Enlightenment thinkers applied emerging standards of evidence and reasoning to Plato's ancient account. The Swedish scholar Olaus Rudbeck emerged as perhaps the most ambitious and systematic supporter of Atlantis theories during this period. His huge work, Atlantica eller Mannheim, published in 4 volumes between 1679 and 1702, represented an extraordinary attempt to relocate Plato's lost civilization within the familiar geography of Scandinavia. Rudbeck, who held the chair of medicine at Uppsala University and had extensive knowledge of Nordic archaeology and linguistics, developed an elaborate theory identifying Sweden as the original Atlantis described by Plato. Rudbeck's identification of Sweden with Atlantis rested on a complex word-origin argument that traced the name Atlantis through various linguistic transformations to Atland, which he interpreted as an ancient name for Swedish territory. He argued that classical authors had systematically misunderstood the geographical references in ancient sources, placing Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean when the original accounts actually referred to the Baltic Sea region. According to Rudbeck's reconstruction, the Pillars of Hercules mentioned by Plato did not refer to the Strait of Gibraltar, but rather to some northern geographical feature, possibly the narrow passages between Danish islands or the entrance to the Baltic Sea itself. The archaeological evidence that Rudbeck gathered in support of his theory reflected the limited but growing knowledge of Scandinavian prehistory available in the late 17th century. He pointed to the numerous Bronze Age burial mounds scattered across the Swedish landscape as evidence of an ancient civilization of extraordinary sophistication and wealth. The elaborate grave goods discovered in these burials, including intricate metalwork and imported materials from distant regions, suggested to Rudbeck a level of cultural development and international trade connections that matched Plato's descriptions of Atlantean prosperity and influence. Rudbeck's linguistic analysis extended beyond simple word-origin connections to encompass a comprehensive theory about the relationship between ancient Swedish and classical languages. He argued that many fundamental terms in Greek and Latin actually came from Proto-Germanic roots preserved in Swedish, suggesting that Scandinavian civilization had provided the foundation for classical Mediterranean cultures rather than the reverse. This linguistic priority, according to Rudbeck, explained how ancient Swedish traditions about their own glorious past had eventually reached Egyptian priests and ultimately influenced Plato's account. The geographical features of Sweden and its surrounding regions provided Rudbeck with numerous parallels to Plato's description of Atlantis. The complex island chains along Sweden's eastern coast, with their intricate patterns of islands, straits, and sheltered harbors, seem to echo the concentric rings of land and water that Plato attributed to the Atlantean capital. The extensive lake systems of central Sweden, connected by rivers and navigable waterways, offered a believable model for the elaborate canal networks that Plato described, as helping both transportation and irrigation throughout Atlantean territory. Rudbeck's reconstruction of ancient Swedish climate and geography relied heavily on his understanding of post-glacial geological processes, which represented cutting-edge scientific knowledge for his era. He argued that the Baltic Sea region had undergone dramatic changes since ancient times, with land elevation and sea level changes transforming the geographical relationships between land and water. These changes, according to Rudbeck, explained why contemporary Scandinavia no longer matched Plato's descriptions exactly, while preserving enough similarities to reveal the underlying correspondence. The political implications of Rudbeck's theory extended far beyond academic scholarship to include questions of national identity and cultural prestige that resonated powerfully in 17th century Sweden. The Swedish Empire under Charles XI had reached unprecedented territorial extent, controlling much of the Baltic region and asserting influence throughout northern Europe. Rudbeck's identification of Sweden as the original Atlantis provided historical justification for Swedish political dominance, while establishing the cultural superiority of Nordic civilization over classical Mediterranean traditions. Contemporary critics of Rudbeck's theory focused primarily on his word origin methods and geographical assumptions, rather than challenging his archaeological evidence directly. The German scholar Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, despite his general admiration for Rudbeck's learning, expressed doubt about the linguistic connections that formed the foundation of the Swedish scholar's argument. Leibniz noted that similar word origin methods could be used to connect virtually any modern language with ancient terms, making such arguments inherently unreliable without independent supporting evidence. The broader intellectual context of late 17th century scholarship provided both support and challenges for Rudbeck's approach to ancient texts. The emerging discipline of comparative linguistics had begun to reveal genuine historical relationships between different language families, lending credibility to arguments based on word origin analysis. However, the systematic methods that would later characterize historical linguistics remained undeveloped, allowing scholars considerable freedom in proposing word origin connections that later investigation would prove unfounded. French scholars of the early 18th century developed alternative approaches to the Atlantis story that reflected their nation's growing involvement in global exploration and colonial expansion. The mathematician and geographer Philippe Buach proposed in 1737 that Atlantis had been located in the North Atlantic region, possibly corresponding to submerged land masses between Europe and North America. Buach's theory drew on emerging oceanographic knowledge and geological speculation about past changes in sea level, representing an early attempt to apply scientific reasoning to the geographical aspects of Plato's account. Buach's cartographic work provided visual representation of his theories through detailed maps showing hypothetical Atlantic land masses that might have existed in ancient times. His Carte physique et politique de l'Atlantique depicted a series of islands and shallow areas that could believably have supported the large population and extensive territories that Plato attributed to Atlantis. The map incorporated contemporary knowledge about ocean depths and underwater topography, while extrapolating possible ancient configurations based on geological theories about crust movement and sea level change. The influence of emerging geological knowledge on Atlantis theories became increasingly significant throughout the 18th century as scholars developed more sophisticated understanding of Earth's physical processes. The recognition that sea levels had changed dramatically over geological time provided a believable mechanism for explaining how large land masses might have disappeared beneath ocean waters. The discovery of marine fossils in mountain regions demonstrated that current geographical relationships between land and sea differed significantly from past configurations, lending credibility to claims about vanished continents. Voltaire's treatment of the Atlantis story in his essay Sur les Moeurs showed the Enlightenment's critical approach to ancient authorities and historical claims. Rather than accepting Plato's account at face value or attempting to identify specific geographical locations for Atlantis, Voltaire subjected the story to systematic rational analysis that revealed numerous internal inconsistencies and implausibilities. His criticism focused particularly on the chronological problems posed by Plato's dating and the absence of supporting evidence from other ancient sources. The methodological innovations of 18th century historiography provided new tools for evaluating ancient texts that fundamentally changed scholarly approaches to stories like Atlantis. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire demonstrated how careful source criticism and systematic comparison of different accounts could reveal the historical accuracy or inaccuracy of ancient claims. These methods, when applied to the Atlantis story, highlighted the unique character of Plato's account and its isolation from other ancient historical traditions. The expansion of European knowledge about Pacific Ocean geography through the voyages of James Cook and other explorers provided fresh contexts for interpreting ancient accounts of distant lands. The discovery of sophisticated Polynesian civilizations scattered across vast oceanic distances demonstrated that advanced cultures could indeed exist on remote islands, lending some credibility to claims about ancient Atlantic civilizations. However, the absence of any archaeological evidence for large-scale civilization in the Atlantic region contrasted sharply with the abundant material remains of Pacific island cultures. German scholars of the mid-18th century developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to ancient mythology and historical stories that influenced interpretations of the Atlantis tale. Johann David Michaelis's work on biblical chronology and ancient Near Eastern history provided methodological frameworks for evaluating claims about ancient civilizations and their historical relationships. His emphasis on linguistic evidence and comparative cultural analysis offered alternatives to the purely geographical approaches that had dominated earlier Atlantis speculation. The emergence of systematic archaeology during the later 18th century began to provide concrete evidence about ancient civilizations that could be compared with Plato's descriptions of Atlantis. The excavation of Pompeii and Herculaneum revealed the material culture of ancient urban civilizations with unprecedented detail, allowing scholars to evaluate the believability of Plato's claims about Atlantean technology and social organization. The absence of archaeological evidence for comparably advanced ancient civilizations in Atlantic regions became increasingly problematic for theories supporting the historical accuracy of Plato's account. The philosophical implications of Atlantis theories also received increased attention during the Enlightenment, as scholars grappled with questions about the relationship between historical truth and moral instruction. David Hume's analysis of testimony and evidence in his inquiry concerning human understanding provided frameworks for evaluating extraordinary historical claims that could be applied to stories like Atlantis. His emphasis on the inherent improbability of miraculous or extraordinary events challenged scholars to provide exceptional evidence for exceptional claims about ancient civilizations. The development of comparative mythology during the later 18th century offered new interpretive frameworks for understanding stories about lost civilizations and ancient catastrophes. Scholars began to recognize similar patterns in flood myths and accounts of vanished peoples across different cultures, suggesting that such stories might preserve distorted memories of actual historical events rather than representing pure fiction. This approach allowed for more nuanced interpretations of the Atlantis story that acknowledged both its mythological character and its possible historical foundations. The influence of Enlightenment rationalism on Atlantis interpretation produced increasingly sophisticated attempts to separate the story's potentially historical elements from its obviously fictional elaborations. Some scholars argued that Plato might have based his account on genuine historical traditions about ancient Mediterranean civilizations, while adding fictional details to serve his philosophical purposes. This approach required careful analysis of which aspects of the story seemed most historically believable and which appeared to serve primarily literary or hidden meaning functions. The growing body of ethnographic knowledge about non-European civilizations provided additional contexts for evaluating Plato's descriptions of Atlantean society and culture. Reports from European travelers and missionaries about complex political systems, sophisticated technologies, and elaborate religious practices among various indigenous peoples demonstrated that the social features attributed to Atlantis were not inherently unbelievable. However, the absence of any contemporary civilization matching the specific combination of characteristics described by Plato continued to challenge theories supporting the account's historical accuracy. The publication of Atlantis, the antediluvian world in 1882, marked a huge shift in how the Western world understood and interpreted Plato's ancient story. Ignatius Donnelly, a charismatic former congressman from Minnesota with no formal training in archaeology or ancient history, produced a work that would fundamentally reshape popular ideas about human prehistory and establish lasting myths about lost civilizations that persist to this day. His 500-page book, dense with citations, maps, and comparative analyses, presented itself as rigorous scholarship while advancing theories that professional archaeologists and historians found deeply problematic. Donnelly's background as a populist politician, rather than an academic scholar, profoundly influenced his approach to the Atlantis question. Born in Philadelphia in 1831, he had built his career on challenging established authorities and championing the common man against entrenched elites. His political experience in Minnesota territorial politics and his 3 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives had sharpened his skills in persuasive speaking and popular communication. When he turned his attention to ancient history, he brought the same combative spirit and popular sensibilities that had characterized his political career, positioning himself as a truth-telling outsider, challenging the dogmas of academic establishments. The intellectual climate of the 1880s provided fertile ground for Donnelly's revolutionary claims about human prehistory. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species had fundamentally altered scientific understanding of human development, while archaeological discoveries across Europe, Egypt, and the Americas were revealing evidence of sophisticated ancient civilizations that challenged traditional biblical timelines. The general public, educated enough to follow scientific developments, but lacking specialized knowledge to evaluate competing claims, proved remarkably open to bold new theories that promised to explain mysterious archaeological phenomena and ancient myths within comprehensive theoretical frameworks. Donnelly's central idea rested on the proposition that Plato's Atlantis had been a real historical civilization, whose destruction approximately 11,000 years ago had scattered survivors across the globe, carrying advanced knowledge and cultural practices that became the foundation for all later human civilizations. This catastrophic scattering, according to Donnelly, explained the remarkable similarities he claimed to observe between ancient cultures separated by vast geographical distances. Rather than viewing these similarities as evidence of independent human development or later cultural contact, Donnelly argued they represented the fragmentary preservation of a common Atlantean heritage. The methodological approach that Donnelly used in building his argument combined selective citation of legitimate archaeological and ethnographic sources with speculative interpretations that extended far beyond what the evidence could reasonably support. He demonstrated remarkable industry in gathering comparative material from diverse cultures, citing everything from Aztec creation myths to Egyptian pyramid construction techniques to Celtic folklore. However, his analysis consistently emphasized superficial similarities while ignoring fundamental differences, and he showed little concern for the chronological contexts that would have been essential for establishing actual historical connections. Donnelly's treatment of flood myths provided a representative example of his methods. He compiled extensive lists of flood stories from cultures around the world, noting apparent similarities in their descriptions of worldwide catastrophes that destroyed earlier civilizations. From these parallels, he argued that all flood myths preserve distorted memories of the actual destruction of Atlantis, transmitted through oral traditions by scattered survivors. This interpretation allowed him to treat diverse mythological traditions as supporting historical evidence, while dismissing the obvious differences between various flood stories as minor corruptions introduced during centuries of oral transmission. The linguistic evidence that Donnelly gathered in support of his theories reflected both the strengths and weaknesses of 19th-century comparative philology. He identified numerous words from different language families that appeared to share common roots, arguing that these similarities demonstrated descent from a common Atlantean linguistic ancestor. His word origin analyses ranged from believable connections between related Indo-European languages to wildly speculative derivations that linked unrelated linguistic families through chains of hypothetical sound changes. Professional linguists recognized that Donnelly's methods could be used to prove virtually any desired linguistic relationship, making his conclusions essentially meaningless from a scholarly perspective. The architectural parallels that formed another pillar of Donnelly's argument drew on the growing body of archaeological knowledge about ancient construction techniques and big buildings. He noted that cultures as diverse as the ancient Egyptians, Mesoamerican civilizations, and various European megalithic builders had all constructed massive stone structures using sophisticated engineering techniques. These similarities, according to Donnelly, could only be explained by assuming that all these cultures had inherited their architectural knowledge from Atlantean colonists who had escaped the Great Catastrophe. Donnelly's analysis of pyramid construction proved particularly influential in establishing lasting Atlantis myths. He argued that the mathematical precision evident in Egyptian pyramids, combined with similar structures found in Mexico and other regions, demonstrated the global spread of advanced Atlantean knowledge. His calculations of pyramid dimensions and astronomical alignments, while often mathematically accurate, extended into speculative interpretations about encoded ancient wisdom that went far beyond what the archaeological evidence could support. The popular fascination with pyramid mysteries that his work helped establish would influence later generations of alternative historians and conspiracy theorists. The metallurgical evidence that Donnelly cited reflected genuine archaeological discoveries about ancient metalworking techniques that had impressed contemporary scholars. The sophisticated bronze and iron technologies found in various ancient cultures, combined with evidence of extensive trade networks that had distributed metals across vast distances, suggested to Donnelly a level of technological coordination that required centralized direction from an advanced mother civilization. His interpretation ignored the well-documented gradual development of metallurgical techniques through cultural contact and technological innovation, instead attributing all advances to Atlantean inheritance. The botanical and zoological arguments that Donnelly advanced demonstrated both his wide reading in contemporary scientific literature and his tendency to extend legitimate observations into unsupported theoretical frameworks. He noted that many cultivated plants and domesticated animals appeared to have been developed at the same time in different regions of the world, suggesting to him coordinated agricultural development directed by Atlantean colonists. His analysis ignored the extensive scholarly work on plant and animal domestication that had already demonstrated independent development in different regions, instead interpreting all agricultural similarities as evidence of common Atlantean origin. The religious and mythological parallels that Donnelly identified formed perhaps the most emotionally compelling aspect of his argument for contemporary readers. He compiled extensive catalogs of similar creation myths, hero legends, and religious practices from cultures around the world, arguing that these similarities demonstrated the global influence of Atlantean religious traditions. His analysis of flood myths, creation stories, and tales of culture-bearing gods arriving from across the sea resonated powerfully with readers familiar with biblical narratives and classical mythology, providing a framework that seemed to unify diverse religious traditions within a single historical explanation. The impact of Donnelly's work on popular consciousness proved immediate and deep, transforming Atlantis from an obscure philosophical dialogue into a central reference point for discussions about human prehistory and lost civilizations. The book's commercial success was extraordinary for a work of scholarship, going through multiple editions and translations that brought Donnelly's theories to readers across Europe and America. Public lectures based on the book drew large audiences eager to hear about the dramatic revelations that promised to revolutionize understanding of human history. The Victorian context that made Donnelly's theories particularly appealing reflected broader cultural anxieties and aspirations that characterized the late 19th century. The rapid pace of technological change and imperial expansion had created unprecedented awareness of human potential, while simultaneously raising questions about the permanence of civilizational achievements. Donnelly's story of a great civilization destroyed by natural catastrophe spoke to contemporary fears about the fragility of progress, while his emphasis on the global spread of Atlantean knowledge appealed to Victorian confidence in the civilizing mission of advanced cultures. The racial implications of Donnelly's theories, while often implicit rather than clearly stated, reflected the racial hierarchies and evolutionary assumptions that characterized Victorian anthropological thinking. His argument that all human civilizational achievements ultimately came from Atlantean sources suggested that contemporary primitive peoples represented degraded remnants of once advanced cultures rather than examples of earlier evolutionary stages. This interpretation allowed Victorian readers to maintain beliefs in racial hierarchy, while acknowledging the sophisticated achievements of non-European cultures that archaeological discoveries were revealing. The influence of Donnelly's work on later Atlantis researchers proved both extensive and lasting, establishing interpretive frameworks and evidence standards that would characterize alternative archaeology for generations. His emphasis on comparative methods, while methodologically flawed, provided a template that later writers would follow in developing their own theories about ancient civilizations. The specific parallels he identified between different cultures became standard reference points for later Atlantis literature, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of citation that gave his arguments apparent scholarly support. The professional archaeological community's response to Donnelly's work reflected the growing tensions between academic specialists and popular writers that would characterize debates about ancient history throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While some scholars acknowledged Donnelly's industry in gathering comparative material, they uniformly rejected his theoretical framework and interpretive methods. The absence of archaeological evidence for any advanced civilization in the Atlantic region during the time period Donnelly proposed remained a fundamental obstacle to accepting his theories, regardless of the superficial parallels he identified between different cultures. The establishment of specific Atlantis images through Donnelly's work created lasting influences on popular culture and alternative historical thinking that extended far beyond scholarly debates. His emphasis on advanced ancient technology, global catastrophic destruction, and the preservation of secret knowledge by survivor populations became standard elements in later, lost civilization stories. The specific details he provided about Atlantean society, technology, and global influence became standard references that later writers would elaborate and modify while maintaining the basic framework he established. The methodological innovations that Donnelly introduced, despite their scholarly limitations, demonstrated new possibilities for synthesizing diverse sources of information in support of comprehensive historical theories. His use of comparative analysis, while often superficial and selective, showed how apparent patterns across different cultures could be gathered as evidence for historical claims. The visual presentation of his arguments through maps, charts, and illustrations provided models for later popular historical writing that emphasized accessibility and dramatic impact over scholarly rigor. The lasting appeal of Donnelly's theories reflected deeper human needs for comprehensive explanations of historical mysteries and cultural similarities that conventional academic approaches seemed unable to satisfy. His story provided satisfying answers to questions about the origins of civilization, the meaning of ancient myths, and the connections between geographically separated cultures that resonated with readers seeking alternatives to fragmented specialist knowledge. The emotional satisfaction of his grand, unified theory of human prehistory proved more compelling to general audiences than the cautious provisional conclusions that characterize professional archaeological scholarship. The transformation of Atlantis from Donnelly's pseudo-archaeological idea into a cornerstone of modern occult doctrine began with Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's ambitious synthesis of Eastern philosophy, Western esotericism, and speculative anthropology in the 1880s. Blavatsky, a Russian aristocrat turned spiritual teacher, possessed an extraordinary talent for weaving together different religious and philosophical traditions into comprehensive cosmological systems that promised to reveal hidden truths about human spiritual evolution. Her huge work, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, elevated Atlantis from a lost civilization into a crucial stage in humanity's cosmic development, establishing interpretive frameworks that would influence esoteric thought for more than a century. Blavatsky's approach to Atlantis differed fundamentally from Donnelly's archaeological methods, drawing instead on claimed access to ancient wisdom preserved in Tibetan monasteries and transmitted through psychic revelation. She asserted that her teachings came from the Akashic Records, a cosmic repository of all human experience accessible through advanced spiritual development, and from direct communication with Mahatmas, ascended masters who guided human evolution from hidden retreats in the Himalayas. This claimed supernatural authority allowed her to present detailed accounts of Atlantean civilization without relying on conventional historical evidence, positioning her revelations as superior to both academic scholarship and popular speculation. The doctrine of root races formed the theoretical foundation of Blavatsky's Atlantis teachings, providing a framework that connected individual spiritual development with cosmic evolutionary cycles. According to Theosophical cosmology, humanity progressed through 7 distinct root races, each representing a different stage of physical and spiritual evolution occurring over millions of years. The 4th root race, known as the Atlanteans, had inhabited the Earth during a period when the planet's geography, climate, and spiritual conditions differed dramatically from contemporary circumstances. These beings possessed physical and psychic capabilities that modern humans had largely lost, representing both an evolutionary peak and a cautionary example of spiritual failure. The Atlantean root race, as described in Theosophical literature, encompassed several subraces that developed different characteristics and capabilities over millions of years. The earliest Atlanteans were giants possessing natural psychic powers, direct communion with spiritual hierarchies, and technological capabilities that operated through spiritual rather than mechanical principles. Their civilization reached heights of material and spiritual achievement that surpassed anything known to recorded history, with cities of crystalline beauty, flying vehicles powered by spiritual energy, and social systems based on direct psychic communication between individuals and governing councils. Blavatsky's description of Atlantean technology emphasized its integration with spiritual principles rather than mechanical engineering. The Atlanteans supposedly powered their vehicles and machinery through manipulation of subtle energies that modern science had not yet discovered, using crystals and sound vibrations to achieve effects that contemporary technology accomplished through crude mechanical means. Their architecture incorporated sacred geometry and harmonic principles that created buildings serving at the same time as functional spaces and spiritual instruments, with temples that could amplify psychic abilities and help communication with higher spiritual planes. The social organization of Atlantean civilization, according to Theosophical teachings, reflected the advanced spiritual development of its inhabitants during the race's early periods. Natural psychic abilities eliminated the need for complex governmental bureaucracies, as individuals could communicate directly with qualified leaders and participate in collective decision-making through telepathic consensus. The absence of deception and hidden motives in a psychically transparent society created social harmony that modern civilizations, dependent on external laws and enforcement mechanisms, could barely understand. The spiritual practices of the Atlanteans involved direct participation in cosmic processes that later civilizations could only approach through symbolic rituals and philosophical speculation. They maintained conscious contact with the spiritual hierarchies guiding planetary evolution, receiving direct instruction in the laws governing matter and energy manipulation. Their religious ceremonies were functional working sessions that actually affected physical and spiritual conditions rather than symbolic representations of abstract theological concepts, making their priests at the same time scientists, engineers, and spiritual teachers. The decline and destruction of Atlantean civilization provided Blavatsky with a powerful illustration of the consequences of spiritual decline and the misuse of occult knowledge. As the root race progressed through its evolutionary cycle, later generations gradually lost their natural spiritual abilities while retaining dangerous technological capabilities. The integration of spiritual and material power that had characterized early Atlantean civilization gave way to the separation of these domains, with a priestly class hoarding occult knowledge, while political leaders pursued material ambitions divorced from spiritual wisdom. The practice of black magic emerged during Atlantis' declining period as individuals and groups began using spiritual knowledge for selfish purposes rather than cosmic service. The same psychic abilities and energy manipulation techniques that had created Atlantean civilization's golden age became tools for personal glorification and the domination of others. Secret societies developed within Atlantean society, preserving dangerous occult practices while corrupting the spiritual teachings that had originally guided the race's development. The final destruction of Atlantis occurred through a combination of natural catastrophes and the consequences of spiritual corruption. According to Theosophical accounts, the misuse of spiritual forces had disrupted the subtle energy patterns maintaining the continent's physical stability, while the accumulation of negative karma from black magic practices had attracted destructive cosmic influences. The great cataclysm that sank Atlantis beneath the ocean represented both a natural geological process and a spiritual cleansing that removed a corrupted civilization whose continued existence would have hindered planetary evolution. The survivors of Atlantis' destruction carried both beneficial knowledge and dangerous corruption to other parts of the world, establishing the foundation for later civilizations while perpetuating the spiritual conflicts that had destroyed their homeland. Some Atlantean refugees preserved authentic spiritual teachings and became the founders of ancient mystery schools in Egypt, India, and other regions, where esoteric knowledge continued to be transmitted through initiated lineages. Other survivors brought corrupted practices and became the source of black magic traditions that continued to threaten human spiritual development throughout history. The influence of Atlantean karma on later human evolution explained, according to Theosophical doctrine, many of the spiritual and social problems affecting modern civilization. The same souls who had participated in Atlantis' rise and fall were reincarnating in contemporary times, bringing both advanced capabilities and unresolved spiritual conflicts from their previous existence. The technological achievements of the modern era represented a partial recovery of Atlantean abilities, but without the spiritual wisdom necessary to use these powers constructively, humanity risked repeating the same destructive patterns that had led to Atlantis' downfall. Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophical interpretation of Atlantis built upon theosophical foundations while developing distinctive approaches to spiritual evolution and human development that reflected his background in German idealist philosophy and his personal clairvoyant investigations. Steiner, who had initially been associated with the Theosophical Society, before founding his own Anthroposophical Society in 1913, claimed direct spiritual perception of Atlantean civilization through developed supersensible faculties that allowed him to investigate past evolutionary periods with scientific precision. Steiner's account of Atlantean civilization emphasized the fundamental differences between ancient and modern consciousness that made direct comparison between these periods problematic. According to anthroposophical teachings, the Atlanteans possessed a dreamlike consciousness that provided direct access to spiritual realities, but lacked the sharp intellectual discrimination that characterized post-Atlantean thinking. Their perception of the physical world remained fluid and changeable, allowing them to work with natural forces in ways that modern consciousness, fixed in rigid conceptual frameworks, could no longer achieve. The educational methods used in Atlantean civilization reflected their different relationship to knowledge and learning. According to Steiner's investigations, rather than acquiring information through external instruction, Atlanteans developed their capabilities through direct participation in cosmic processes guided by advanced teachers who possessed full spiritual vision. The development of individual faculties occurred through graduated exposure to spiritual influences that awakened dormant capacities, rather than through the accumulation of conceptual knowledge that characterizes later educational approaches. The agricultural and technological practices of the Atlanteans operated through their ability to work directly with the life forces animating plants, animals, and natural processes. They could stimulate plant growth, direct animal behavior, and manipulate weather patterns through spiritual influence rather than mechanical intervention. Their tools and machines functioned as extensions of human will and spiritual energy, rather than as independent mechanical devices, creating a technology that was at the same time more advanced and more harmoniously integrated with natural processes than modern industrial methods. The social institutions of Atlantean civilization reflected their natural spiritual hierarchy based on actual levels of spiritual development rather than external social conventions. Leadership positions were occupied by individuals whose advanced spiritual faculties qualified them to perceive the needs of the community and the requirements of evolutionary development. The absence of democratic political processes reflected not authoritarian oppression, but the natural recognition of spiritual authority by those with less developed capacities. The mystery centers that flourished during Atlantis's later periods served as bridges between the ancient dream consciousness and the emerging intellectual awareness that would characterize post-Atlantean civilization. These institutions provided controlled environments where selected individuals could develop new forms of consciousness while maintaining connection to the spiritual realities that Atlantean culture had naturally accessed. The initiation practices developed in these centers became the foundation for the mystery schools that preserved spiritual knowledge throughout later historical periods. The catastrophic end of Atlantean civilization represented a necessary evolutionary transition rather than simply a punishment for spiritual corruption. According to Steiner's interpretation, the dream consciousness that had enabled Atlantean achievements had become an obstacle to further human development, preventing the emergence of individual freedom and moral responsibility that required clear intellectual discrimination. The destruction of Atlantis allowed human evolution to proceed toward the development of ego consciousness and independent thinking that would eventually enable individuals to freely choose their spiritual development. The post-Atlantean cultural epochs described by Steiner traced the gradual recovery and transformation of Atlantean capabilities through different approaches to spiritual and material development. The ancient Indian epoch emphasized withdrawal from material existence to preserve direct spiritual perception, while the Persian period began the process of spiritualizing material work. The Egyptian Chaldean epoch developed the intellectual and technical capabilities necessary for manipulating physical forces, leading eventually to the Greco-Roman period's achievement of individual personality development. Edgar Case's psychic readings about Atlantis, delivered during trance states between 1923 and 1944, provided the most detailed and influential modern account of the lost civilization, while establishing interpretive frameworks that would dominate New Age approaches to ancient mysteries. Case, a photographer from Kentucky with no formal education in history or archaeology, claimed to access information about past lives and historical events through psychic means while in an unconscious state. His 14,000 documented readings included over 700 references to Atlantis, creating a comprehensive story that combined theosophical concepts with distinctive American metaphysical traditions. The Atlantean civilization described in Case's readings spanned a period from approximately 200,000 to 10,000 BC, covering multiple technological and spiritual developments that occurred over vast time periods. According to these psychic revelations, Atlantis had experienced three major periods of destruction caused by the misuse of advanced technology, with the final cataclysm around 10,500 BC completely submerging the continent beneath the Atlantic Ocean. The survivors of these destruction had migrated to various parts of the world, carrying Atlantean knowledge and establishing the foundations for ancient Egyptian, Mayan, and other advanced civilizations. The technology attributed to Atlantis in Case's readings centered on the use of crystals for generating and focusing various forms of energy that could power vehicles, provide light, and help long-distance communication. The great crystal that served as the primary power source for Atlantean civilization was described as a massive stone capable of concentrating solar and cosmic energies for practical applications. The misuse of this crystal technology by later generations, who turned it toward destructive purposes and personal glorification, ultimately caused the geological instabilities that led to the continent's destruction. The social organization of Atlantis, according to Case's readings, involved a complex mixture of highly advanced spiritual beings and more primitive human types who coexisted in relationships that sometimes created conflict and exploitation. The Sons of the Law of One represented the spiritually advanced faction that sought to use Atlantean technology for constructive purposes and the elevation of all consciousness, while the Sons of Belial pursued selfish material goals and the exploitation of less developed beings for personal benefit. The increasing dominance of the Sons of Belial during Atlantis's later periods created the spiritual conditions that attracted the final catastrophic destruction. The reincarnation patterns described in Case's readings suggested that many souls who had lived in Atlantis were returning to incarnation during the 20th century, bringing both advanced capabilities and unresolved karmic patterns from their previous existence. These returning Atlantean souls were said to possess natural abilities in technology, healing, and spiritual development that could contribute to human progress, but they also carried tendencies toward the misuse of power and the pursuit of material goals that had characterized Atlantis's decline. The influence of Case's Atlantis readings on 20th century New Age movements proved deep and lasting, providing a mythological framework that connected ancient wisdom with contemporary spiritual seeking, while offering hope for the recovery of lost human capabilities. The emphasis on crystal technology resonated with New Age interests in alternative healing and energy work, while the reincarnation themes provided explanations for individual spiritual experiences and capabilities that seemed to transcend ordinary human limitations. The archaeological predictions contained in Case's readings, including claims about the future discovery of Atlantean records in Egypt and the Bahamas, created ongoing expectations among his followers that physical evidence would eventually validate his psychic revelations. The identification of specific locations where Atlantean artifacts and records were supposedly preserved, including chambers beneath the Sphinx and temple complexes in the Caribbean region, provided focal points for continued investigation and speculation that extended far beyond Case's death in 1945. The transformation of Atlantis from Plato's philosophical lesson into a spiritual teaching tool, reflected broader changes in Western religious and intellectual culture during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The decline of traditional Christian authority, combined with increased awareness of Eastern religions and the emergence of modern psychology, created cultural space for alternative spiritual systems that promised direct access to higher knowledge and personal transformation. Atlantis provided an ideal vehicle for these aspirations, offering a historical precedent for human spiritual capabilities while explaining the apparent loss of these abilities through understandable story frameworks. The occult interpretation of Atlantis also served important psychological functions for individuals seeking meaning and identity within rapidly changing modern societies. The claim of Atlantean past lives provided explanations for feelings of alienation from contemporary culture, while suggesting that individuals possessed hidden capabilities that transcended ordinary human limitations. The story of spiritual decline and potential recovery offered hope for personal and collective transformation that resonated with both individual spiritual seeking and broader social reform movements. The integration of Atlantis themes into various occult and New Age movements created self-reinforcing belief systems that generated their own evidence through psychic revelations, channeled communications, and interpretive frameworks that could accommodate virtually any unusual experience or archaeological discovery. The absence of conventional historical evidence for Atlantis became, within these systems, additional proof of the conspiracy of materialistic science to suppress spiritual truths that threatened established authorities and conventional worldviews. The systematic application of modern scientific methods to Atlantis claims began in earnest during the early 20th century as professional archaeology established rigorous standards for evidence evaluation and peer review processes that would fundamentally challenge the speculative theories that had flourished during the Victorian era. The development of stratigraphic excavation techniques, radiocarbon dating methods, and comparative archaeological analysis provided tools for investigating ancient civilizations with unprecedented precision, creating opportunities to test the various claims about Atlantean influence on known historical cultures, while at the same time revealing the absence of evidence for any advanced Atlantic civilization during the periods proposed by different theorists. The archaeological investigation of Mediterranean Bronze Age civilizations during the first half of the 20th century produced discoveries that initially seemed to support some aspects of Atlantis theories, while ultimately demonstrating the dangers of superficial historical parallels. The excavation of Minoan palaces on Crete by Sir Arthur Evans, beginning in 1900, revealed a sophisticated civilization that had flourished during the second millennium BC, possessing advanced hydraulic engineering, elaborate artistic traditions, and extensive maritime trade networks that connected the Aegean world with Egypt, Anatolia, and the Western Mediterranean. The sudden collapse of Minoan civilization around 1450 BC, apparently caused by natural disasters combined with foreign invasion, provided a historical precedent for the kind of catastrophic civilizational destruction described in Plato's account. Evans himself initially drew clear parallels between Minoan Crete and Plato's Atlantis, noting similarities in their island locations, maritime orientations, advanced technologies, and sudden destruction. The Minoan palaces at Knossos and Phaistos featured elaborate water management systems, including indoor plumbing, drainage networks, and decorative fountains that seemed to echo Plato's descriptions of Atlantean hydraulic engineering. The extensive storage facilities for oil, wine, and grain suggested the kind of agricultural abundance that Plato attributed to Atlantis, while the evidence for long-distance trade in luxury goods indicated the wealth and international connections that characterized Plato's lost civilization. The artistic representations found in Minoan palaces provided additional apparent parallels to Atlantean themes, including frescoes depicting bull-leaping ceremonies that seemed to correspond to Plato's account of ritual bull sacrifice in the Temple of Poseidon. The prominent role of maritime imagery in Minoan art, from dolphin frescoes to ship representations, reinforced the connection to Plato's emphasis on Atlantean naval power and oceanic orientation. The apparent peaceful character of early Minoan civilization, evidenced by the absence of fortification walls around major settlements, suggested the kind of harmonious society that Plato attributed to early Atlantean periods before moral corruption set in. However, as archaeological investigation of Minoan civilization progressed and more sophisticated analytical methods were applied, the apparent parallels to Atlantis began to dissolve under closer scrutiny. The chronological framework established through pottery analysis and radiocarbon dating placed Minoan civilization firmly within the second millennium BC, far removed from the 9500 BC date that Plato had specified for Atlantis. The geographical scale of Minoan influence, while impressive for its time period, remained limited to the eastern Mediterranean region rather than covering the global empire that Plato attributed to Atlantis. More fundamentally, detailed analysis of Minoan society revealed characteristics that contradicted essential elements of Plato's account. The decentralized political structure of Minoan Crete, with multiple palace centers operating as independent or semi-independent entities, differed markedly from the unified imperial system that Plato described for Atlantis. The absence of evidence for large-scale military organization or aggressive expansion contradicted Plato's emphasis on Atlantean imperialism and the threat it posed to ancient Athens. The peaceful collapse of many Minoan sites, apparently abandoned rather than destroyed in warfare, failed to match the dramatic military confrontation that formed the climax of Plato's story. The investigation of other Bronze Age civilizations that had been proposed as potential Atlantis candidates produced similar patterns of initial apparent parallels, followed by more detailed analysis that revealed fundamental incompatibilities with Plato's account. The Mycenaean civilization of mainland Greece, with its impressive fortified palaces and evidence of extensive maritime activity, seemed to offer another possible historical basis for the Atlantis story. The Mycenaean linear B tablets revealed a complex bureaucratic system capable of organizing large-scale military and economic activities, while archaeological evidence suggested Mycenaean influence extended throughout the Mediterranean region during the late 2nd millennium BC. Yet systematic analysis of Mycenaean civilization revealed the same chronological and geographical limitations that affected other proposed Atlantis candidates. The Mycenaean world, while impressive in its regional context, operated on a scale far smaller than what Plato attributed to Atlantis. The collapse of Mycenaean civilization around 1200 BC occurred through a gradual process of political fragmentation and economic decline, rather than the sudden catastrophic destruction described in Plato's account. Most significantly, Mycenaean civilization developed within the familiar Mediterranean world, rather than in the Atlantic Ocean location that Plato had specified for Atlantis. The discovery of the Uluburun shipwreck off the Turkish coast in 1982 provided dramatic evidence of the extensive trade networks that connected Bronze Age civilizations across the Mediterranean, revealing a level of international commerce and cultural exchange that exceeded what many scholars had previously imagined possible for the period. The ship's cargo included raw materials and finished goods from across the known world, including Cypriot copper, Nubian gold, Baltic amber, and African ivory, demonstrating that Bronze Age civilizations possessed the maritime capabilities and commercial networks necessary to support the kind of far-flung empire that Plato attributed to Atlantis. However, this evidence of Bronze Age maritime sophistication, rather than supporting Atlantis theories, actually highlighted the absence of any archaeological trace of the massive Atlantic civilization that would have been necessary to coordinate such global activities. The Uluburun cargo could be traced to known sources throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, with each item corresponding to documented production centers and established trade routes. The absence of any artifacts that could be attributed to an unknown Atlantic civilization became increasingly significant as archaeological knowledge of Bronze Age trade networks expanded and became more precise. The development of underwater archaeology during the mid-20th century provided new opportunities to investigate claims about submerged Atlantean ruins, while at the same time revealing the technical challenges and evidence standards necessary for legitimate marine archaeological research. Jacques Cousteau's pioneering work with underwater exploration equipment during the 1940s and 1950s demonstrated the feasibility of systematic archaeological investigation beneath the ocean's surface, while the development of side-scan sonar and other remote sensing technologies made it possible to survey large areas of the ocean floor for potential archaeological sites. The systematic survey of the Atlantic Ocean floor conducted by various oceanographic institutions during the second half of the 20th century produced detailed bathymetric maps that revealed the actual topography of the regions where Atlantis had been proposed to have existed. These surveys demonstrated that the Atlantic Ocean floor consisted primarily of abyssal plains lying at depths of 3,000 to 4,000 meters below sea level, with no evidence of recently submerged continental land masses that could have supported large-scale civilization during the time period suggested by various Atlantis theories. The geological analysis of Atlantic Ocean sediment cores provided additional evidence against the existence of any large land mass in the Atlantic during the periods when Atlantis was supposed to have existed. The sediment layers revealed a consistent pattern of deep ocean deposition extending back millions of years, with no indication of the dramatic geological changes that would have been necessary to submerge a continent-sized landmass within the last 12,000 years. The absence of terrestrial sediments, pollen, or other indicators of nearby land surfaces in the deep Atlantic contradicted claims about recently submerged civilizations. Investigation of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge System revealed the actual geological processes operating in the Atlantic Ocean, demonstrating that the seafloor spreading occurring along this underwater mountain chain was gradually expanding the ocean rather than submerging existing land masses. The volcanic islands associated with the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, including the Azores, Iceland, and various smaller island chains, represented recent geological formations created by volcanic activity rather than remnants of submerged continents. The geological age of these formations, established through radiometric dating of volcanic rocks, placed their emergence far more recently than the periods proposed for Atlantean civilization. The search for Atlantean ruins in the Caribbean region, inspired by Edgar Case's psychic readings and various other alternative theories, produced numerous claims about underwater structures that initially seemed to support the existence of advanced ancient civilizations in Atlantic waters. The Bimini Road Formation off the Bahamas, first publicized in 1968, consisted of rectangular stone blocks arranged in linear patterns on the ocean floor that some researchers interpreted as the remains of ancient roadways or building foundations. The geometric regularity of these formations and their apparent artificial construction suggested to some investigators that they represented archaeological evidence of pre-Columbian civilization in the region. However, detailed geological analysis of the Bimini Road Formation revealed that the rectangular blocks consisted of naturally fractured limestone that had broken along regular joint patterns due to geological stress and chemical weathering processes. The linear arrangement of the blocks resulted from natural geological processes rather than human construction, while the apparent artificial appearance reflected the tendency of limestone to fracture along regular geometric patterns when subjected to particular combinations of geological forces. The dating of the limestone formation placed its origin millions of years before any possible human presence in the region. Similar patterns of initial excitement followed by scientific debunking characterized numerous other claimed discoveries of underwater Atlantean ruins throughout the Atlantic and Caribbean regions. The Yonaguni Monument of Japan, while located in the Pacific rather than Atlantic Ocean, provided another example of natural geological formations that could create the appearance of artificial construction under certain conditions. The stepped terraces and geometric angles that some researchers interpreted as evidence of ancient architecture actually resulted from natural fracturing processes in sedimentary rock formations, as demonstrated through detailed geological analysis. The application of remote sensing technologies to the search for Atlantean ruins revealed both the capabilities and limitations of modern archaeological survey methods. Satellite imagery analysis could identify potential archaeological sites over large areas, while ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry could detect buried structures beneath land surfaces. However, these technologies also demonstrated the absence of any large-scale architectural remains in the regions where Atlantis had been proposed to have existed, despite surveys covering thousands of square kilometers of ocean floor and coastal areas. The investigation of sea level changes during the post-glacial period provided crucial evidence for evaluating claims about recently submerged civilizations. The detailed reconstruction of global sea level fluctuations since the last ice age, based on analysis of coral terraces, marine sediments, and other geological indicators, revealed that sea levels had risen approximately 120 meters since the glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago. This sea level rise had indeed submerged extensive coastal areas and would have destroyed any low-lying civilizations that existed during the glacial period. However, the chronology and geography of post-glacial sea level rise contradicted most Atlantis theories rather than supporting them. The major period of sea level rise occurred between 15,000 and 6,000 years ago, with the most rapid changes taking place before 10,000 years ago. By the time period when most advanced ancient civilizations were developing, sea levels had already stabilized near their current positions. The areas that were submerged by post-glacial sea level rise consisted primarily of continental shelf regions that would have supported only scattered hunter-gatherer populations, rather than the advanced civilizations described in Atlantis literature. The geological investigation of catastrophic events during the time periods proposed for Atlantean destruction revealed evidence of various natural disasters that could have inspired ancient flood myths and accounts of civilizational collapse. The Younger Dryas period, lasting from approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, involved dramatic climate changes that disrupted human societies across large regions. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and tsunamis during various historical periods had indeed caused sudden destruction of coastal settlements and could have provided the basis for oral traditions about catastrophic floods and vanished civilizations. The Santorini volcanic eruption around 1600 BC created a massive tsunami that devastated coastal areas throughout the eastern Mediterranean, providing a believable natural disaster that could have inspired later accounts of sudden civilizational destruction. The archaeological evidence of Minoan sites abandoned after this period suggested that the Santorini eruption had contributed to the collapse of Minoan civilization, creating a historical precedent for the kind of catastrophic destruction described in Plato's account. However, the scale and timing of this event remained far smaller and more recent than what Plato had described for Atlantis. The systematic comparison of ancient flood myths from different cultures revealed both similarities and differences that complicated attempts to trace them to a common historical source. While many cultures possessed traditions about great floods that had destroyed earlier civilizations, the details of these accounts varied significantly in their descriptions of causes, geographical extent, and survival patterns. The similarities that existed could be explained by the common human experience of flood disasters and the psychological tendency to project local catastrophes onto cosmic scales, rather than requiring a single historical event that had affected all cultures at the same time. The peer review process that characterized professional archaeological and geological research provided systematic mechanisms for evaluating claims about ancient civilizations, and ensuring that conclusions were based on reliable evidence rather than speculation or wishful thinking. The requirement that research findings be published in refereed journals, where they would be examined by qualified experts before publication, created quality control standards that eliminated most unsupported claims about Atlantis, while allowing legitimate discoveries to be properly documented and verified. The institutional structure of modern archaeology, with its university departments, professional organizations, and funding agencies, created both opportunities and constraints for investigating alternative theories about ancient civilizations. While this system could be conservative in its acceptance of new ideas, it also provided the resources and expertise necessary for conducting sophisticated research that could definitively resolve questions about proposed archaeological sites and historical claims. The absence of any major archaeological institution that had found convincing evidence for Atlantis reflected the consistent failure of such claims to meet professional evidence standards rather than academic prejudice against unconventional theories. The development of increasingly sophisticated analytical techniques continued to provide new tools for investigating ancient civilizations, while at the same time raising the evidence standards necessary for establishing historical claims. DNA analysis of ancient human remains could trace population movements and cultural contacts with unprecedented precision, while isotopic analysis of artifacts could determine their geographical origins and manufacturing techniques. These methods consistently revealed the complexity and interconnectedness of ancient civilizations, while failing to provide any evidence for the kind of advanced Atlantic civilization described in Atlantis literature. The 20th and 21st centuries witnessed an unprecedented growth of Atlantis theories as advances in underwater exploration, satellite imaging, and geological analysis provided new tools for investigating ancient mysteries, while at the same time inspiring fresh speculation about possible locations for Plato's lost civilization. Unlike earlier centuries, when Atlantis researchers worked primarily from textual analysis and limited archaeological knowledge, modern theorists could draw upon detailed bathymetric surveys, precise dating techniques, and comprehensive databases of ancient civilizations to support their claims. This wealth of new information, however, produced divergent rather than convergent theories, with different researchers identifying potential Atlantis sites across virtually every ocean and continent on Earth. The Mediterranean theory received fresh focus after Spiridon Marinatos' careful study of Bronze Age Aegean societies and how they connected to natural disasters. Marinatos, serving as Greece's Archaeological Service's chief inspector through the 1930s, had observed widespread pumice layers at known locations on Crete that pointed to volcanic devastation instead of war-related conquest. His following digs at Akrotiri on Santorini Island, starting in 1967, uncovered an amazingly well-kept Bronze Age town covered under volcanic debris, offering striking proof of the disastrous explosion that had wrecked the area near 1600 BC. The Akrotiri digs showed an advanced city society with buildings of multiple floors, cutting-edge drainage setups, and detailed wall paintings showing sea scenes and unusual creatures. The quick desertion of the town, with precious items remaining where they were and no signs of robbery or slow abandonment, hinted that residents had run away fast when volcanic danger signs appeared before the ultimate disastrous blast. The magnitude of the Santorini blast, thought to be quadruple the size of the 1883 Krakatoa event, would have created enormous sea waves able to wreck shore towns across the eastern Mediterranean. Marinatos maintained that this disastrous wiping out of Minoan society offered the historical basis for Plato's Atlantis tale, passed down via Egyptian documents, and finally arriving at Solon while he traveled. The location details in Plato's version, based on this reading, had become twisted across hundreds of years of spoken passing down, with the first Aegean spot changed into an Atlantic location that put the tale outside the grasp of current-day checking. The circular bands of ground and sea that Plato gave to Atlantis might stand for a mixed-up recollection of Santorini's round caldera, created by the volcanic peak's fall during the Bronze Age blast. The timeline mismatch between the Santorini blast near 1600 BC and Plato's placement of Atlantis at 9500 BC showed a major problem for this reading, causing different explanations using Egyptian schedule mix-up or intentional timeline changing by Plato. Certain investigators proposed that Egyptian holy men had mixed up moon-based and sun-based years in their math, increasing the real-time gaps by amounts that would move Plato's placement nearer to the Bronze Age time. Different people maintained that Plato had purposely made his tale more old to put it in a legendary perfect age that would boost its thinking effect. The underwater archaeological study of the Santorini caldera through the 1960s and 1970s looked for proof of drowned Bronze Age towns that could back the Atlantis matchup. Jacques Cousteau's trips using cutting-edge underwater investigation gear showed volcanic layers and rock shapes, but didn't find any major archaeological leftovers on the caldera bottom. The huge depth of the caldera, going past 400 meters under ocean height, and the huge volcanic layers that had piled up since the Bronze Age made careful archaeological looking extremely hard. Different Mediterranean ideas came up as investigators used similar disaster-focused readings to different old societies and natural tragedies. The Troy theory, pushed by different German experts through the 1980s, matched Plato's Atlantis with the famous town of Troy, claiming that the Trojan battle kept recollections of a big Bronze Age fight between Eastern and Western forces. The fresh finding of a huge Bronze Age town at Hisarlik in Turkey, with signs of wreckage and leaves that fit parts of Homer's versions, gave archaeological backing for handling old Greek story traditions as historically based instead of totally made up. The Sardinia theory, created by Italian investigator Sergio Frau, moved Atlantis to the Western Mediterranean by reading Plato's location mentions to the Pillars of Hercules differently. Frau claimed that old records had used this name to different tight water passages across the Mediterranean, not just to the Strait of Gibraltar, making it thinkable that Plato's, past the Pillars of Hercules, really meant spots inside the Mediterranean area. The Sardinian society, called the Neuralgic way of life, which grew during the Bronze Age and built thousands of special stone towers over the island, offered proof of a cutting-edge old community that had quickly dropped near 1200 BC. The archaeological study of Neuralgic society showed advanced metalworking methods, wide-ranging trade systems, and complicated community setup that appeared to fit certain parts of Plato's Atlantean community. The round stone towers that named the way of life showed cutting-edge building methods and worked both as protection and ceremony purposes inside towns that could hold big populations. The quick leaving of numerous Neuralgic locations through the late Bronze Age hinted at a disastrous drop that could have sparked later customs about disappeared societies. Yet the location size of Sardinian society stayed restricted to one Mediterranean island, instead of covering the huge lands and worldwide power that Plato gave to Atlantis. The Neuralgic way of life, though amazing in its area setting, revealed no signs of the empire spreading or war fight with old Athens that made up main parts of Plato's tale. The timing of Neuralgic drop to near 1200 BC, though nearer to historical trustworthiness than Plato's 9500 BC, still needed major timeline changes to match with different parts of the Atlantis version. The Black Sea theory came out from rock study findings about striking sea height shifts in the area through the early Holocene time, offering a likely way for the quick flooding of big ground spaces that could have held old societies. William Ryan and Walter Pittman's investigation through the 1990s showed proof that the Black Sea had gone through a disastrous flooding happening near 7,500 years back, when climbing Mediterranean waters broke the natural wall at the Bosporus Strait and flooded a huge freshwater lake that had been at a much lower height. The size of this flooding happening, which would have lifted Black Sea heights by past 100 meters and drowned roughly 100,000 square kilometers of earlier dry ground, offered a trustworthy natural tragedy that might have wrecked shore societies and sparked flood stories that afterward shaped Plato's version. Archaeological looks at the Black Sea bottom using cutting-edge sound gear showed drowned river paths, beach ridges, and different features that backed the being of wide dryland spaces before the flooding happened. Robert Ballard's careful investigation of the Black Sea bottom, using remotely run vehicles, found what looked like kept wooden buildings and different items in the oxygen-free deep waters that stopped normal rotting steps. The timing of these things to roughly 7,000 years back hinted at human beings in the area before the disastrous flooding, backing ideas about drowned societies that could have offered historical bases for afterward flood customs. The great keeping conditions in the Black Sea's oxygen-missing deep waters gave unique chances to look at old natural things that would have rotted in regular sea settings. The Black Sea flooding idea received extra backing from gene and language studies that hinted at quick population scatterings from the area near 7,000 years back, maybe standing for refugee movements started by the disastrous flood. The spreading of Indo-European tongues and linked cultural ways could maybe be followed by population shifts starting in the Black Sea area through this time, offering a way for the passing of flood customs over huge location spaces. Yet the archaeological proof from the Black Sea area didn't show any cutting-edge society matching what Plato told Atlantis. The drowned towns found by Ballard and different investigators looked to stand for basic farming groups instead of the advanced city society with cutting-edge tech and empire setup that marked Plato's version. The disappearance of big buildings, complicated water-handling setups, or signs of faraway trade systems went against key parts of the Atlantis tale. Atlantic ideas had a comeback through the late 20th years, as better ocean study methods made it thinkable to look at earlier unreachable spots of the ocean bottom with unique clearness. The finding of the Azores Plateau, a big underwater rise in the Middle Atlantic that had been over sea height through different rock times, offered a possible spot for Atlantean society that fit Plato's location details while giving a trustworthy way for following drowning. The rock study of the Azores Plateau showed a twisted past of volcanic doing and sea height shifts that had by turns shown and drowned various parts of the area across millions of years. Through the previous ice time, when worldwide sea heights were roughly 120 meters beneath today's level, big parts of the plateau would have made islands or possibly steady ground masses able to hold big populations. The following after-ice age sea height climb might have drowned these spaces, making the type of quick vanishing that Plato gave to Atlantis. The depth mapping of the Azores area using many beam sound setups showed underwater land features that certain investigators read as thinkable fake buildings, covering what looked like square shapes and straight plans of raised spaces that could stand for drowned building bases or harbor structures. The Portuguese ruling body paid for various underwater archaeological trips through the 1990s to look at these features, using cutting-edge, remotely run vehicles able to do detailed sea-bottom looking and sample gathering. The outcomes of these studies turned out to be a letdown for Atlantis fans, as detailed checking showed that the seeming fake buildings were made of natural rock shapes made by volcanic doing and layer steps. The square designs that had appeared to hint at human building really came from regular breaking in volcanic rock shapes, though the straight plans showed natural rock steps instead of planned building planning. The missing of any items, building stuff, or different signs of human beings in the spaces studied went against claims about drowned Atlantean leftovers. The Canary Islands theory, pushed by different Spanish investigators, matched these Atlantic islands as likely leftovers of a bigger Atlantean ground mass that had shrunk to its present size via rock steps. The Guanche society that had lived on the islands before European taking over showed certain cutting-edge marks, covering advanced star knowledge, fancy burial ways, and farming methods fitted to volcanic island situations. The puzzling vanishing of Guanche way of life after Spanish taking over offered a historical match to the wreckage of Atlantis told by Plato. Archaeological study of Guanche locations showed stone building methods, covering huge stonework using big blocks fit together without cement, that appeared to match descriptions of Atlantean buildings. The finding of step pyramids and different big buildings on various Canary Islands hinted at an amount of community setup and building ability that went past what could be thought of as a cut-off island society. The being of dried-out leftovers kept in fancy burial rooms pointed to advanced knowledge of keeping methods that matched ways found in Old Egypt and different cutting-edge societies. Yet the timeline setup made for Guanche society via radiocarbon timing and different methods put its growth well inside the historical time, starting near 1000 BC and going on until Spanish taking over in the 1500 years AD. This timing went against both Plato's old placement for Atlantis and the different backup timelines put forward by current idea makers. The location size of the Canary Islands, though amazing for their cut-off Atlantic spot, stayed way smaller than the continent measurements that Plato gave to Atlantis. The Antarctica theory came out from the debatable work of Charles Hapgood and his idea of crust movement, which put forward that the Earth's outer crust might move fast compared to the inner center, making striking shifts in the location spots of continents and weather areas. Based on this idea, Antarctica had sat in a mild weather area as late as 12,000 years back, maybe holding the cutting-edge society told as Atlantis before crust movement shifted the continent to its present pole spot. Hapgood's checking of old-time maps, especially the Peary Rise map of 1513, hinted that old societies had proper location knowledge of Antarctica's shore before it got covered by ice layers. The detailed showing of what looked like Antarctic shore features in these maps, made hundreds of years before the continent's official finding in 1820, suggested the being of cutting-edge old sailing and map-making abilities that could back ideas about missing societies with worldwide grasp. The rock study of Antarctic ice centers and layer drops offered proof of earlier weather situations that might back ideas about mild situations in the area through latest rock times. Certain ice center facts hinted at times of shrunk ice covering that could have made parts of Antarctica livable, though sea layer centers showed signs of ice-missing shore spaces through different between-ice age times. The finding of cold drops and rock-turned plant leftovers showed that Antarctica had really held mild weathers through earlier rock ages. Yet the timeline setup made via many paths of rock proof put these mild situations millions of years before any thinkable human being in the area. The Antarctic ice layer had been steadily there for no less than 15 million years, with just small changes in spread that never showed big ice-missing ground spaces through the time when human societies could have been. The crust movement idea that made the base of the Antarctica theory didn't have backing from rock proof and went against well-made understanding of plate steps. Current investigators keep putting forward fresh Atlantis spots based on coming up archaeological finds and better checking methods, showing the lasting draw of Plato's tale as an explaining setup for old puzzles. The Doñana National Park theory, created by German investigator Rainer Kuhn, matched a spot in southwest Spain where space pictures showed round and square designs that could stand for the leftovers of Atlantean buildings covered under layer drops. The use of ground-seeing radar and different Earth physics-looking methods to the Doñana location showed underground odd things that might maybe stand for covered buildings, even though clear archaeological study stayed restricted by the location's guarded rank as a national park. The location of the place close to the opening of the Guadalquivir River and near to the usual spot of the Pillars of Hercules appeared to fit Plato's location details more tightly than numerous different put-forward spots. The way used by Atlantis investigators shows both the powers and restrictions of current archaeological and rock study methods when used to guess historical claims. Cutting-edge, distant noticing tools can match likely archaeological places across big spaces and find covered buildings that would be not possible to spot via regular-looking ways. Yet, these identical tools also show the rareness of big archaeological odd things, and how often seeming fake features turn out to be natural rock shapes when carefully checked. The look-over step that controls expert archaeological investigation offers careful judging of claims about old societies while keeping standards of proof that get rid of most guessing ideas. The absence of any look-over archaeological publishing that has backed claims about Atlantean leftovers or items shows the steady failure of such claims to reach expert proof standards instead of school bias toward unusual ideas. The group's setup of current archaeology, with its focus on do-again results and separate checking, makes quality checking ways that tell apart real findings from wanting-it thinking or wrong reading of natural happenings. The mental draw of Atlantis ideas keeps making fresh proposals and readings even with the lack of archaeological backing, showing deeper human wants for full explanations of historical puzzles and cultural doings. The tale setup of the Atlantis story, with its topics of missing wisdom, disastrous wreckage, and secret knowledge, offers a gripping setup for grasping different archaeological odd things and old gains that appear to go past regular expectations about early human abilities. The power of popular media and backup history publications has made self-boosting groups of Atlantis fans who pass information and readings that back their liked ideas while pushing away opposite proof as the outcome of school plots or way restrictions. The internet has made it simpler to pass Atlantis ideas and plan investigation works between hobbyist checkers, making systems of fans who can keep belief setups separate from expert archaeological agreement. The careful judging of current Atlantis ideas needs careful focus to the telling apart between real archaeological questions and guessing historical claims that go past usable proof. Though numerous put forward Atlantis spots match genuine archaeological places that deserve expert study, the reading of these places as leftovers of Plato's exact missing society usually uses guesses and links that can't be backed via hard checking. The leaning to match shallow likenesses between various old ways of life as proof of shared Atlantean start shows the identical way troubles that marked Donnelly's Victorian time guessing. Even with the usability of more advanced checking tools, the continuing hunt for Atlantis shows both the lasting force of Plato's tale and the tests of telling apart between real historical study and wanting-it thinking in the reading of archaeological proof. The growth of put-forward spots and ideas instead of coming together toward an agreed answer hints that the Atlantis tale works better as a story setup for grasping human hopes and worries than as a historical version open to archaeological checking. The change of Atlantis from an unclear thinking dialogue into a ruling cultural happening started with Jules Verne's groundbreaking book 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, put out in 1870. Verne's bright telling of Captain Nemo's underwater meeting with the leftovers of Atlantis grabbed the Victorian thinking with unique strength, making visual and tale agreements that would shape popular showings for the past 100 years. The part where Nemo and Professor Aronnax look at the drowned town via the Nautilus's watching windows showed Atlantis as a touchable archaeological truth, instead of unclear thinking lesson, filled with falling apart temples, dropped statues, and the trash of a once big society kept under the ocean's guarding hold. Verne's technical past as a builder and his careful investigation into current-day scientific growths gave trust to his underwater looking at scenes that totally made-up handlings might not gain. His detailed tellings of diving gear, underwater sailing, and sea archaeology showed genuine tech possibilities, though stretching them into guessing lands that appeared scientifically trustworthy to current-day readers. The Nautilus by itself, with its cutting-edge pushing setups and life-backing abilities, stood for the type of tech gain that could have been thinkable for a cutting-edge old society, making suggested links between Atlantean abilities and current scientific moving forward. The book effect of Verne's Atlantis went way past the exact part in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea to make a pattern for adventure stories that mixed unusual spots, cutting-edge tech, and archaeological puzzles. His way shaped afterward times of adventure writers who took on like formulas of missing societies found via tech ways, making a smaller type that would finally cover everything from Edgar Rice Burroughs' Pellucidar books to current tech excitement stories featuring underwater looking at and old secrets. H.G. Wells's input to Atlantis books took a variety of ways, focusing on community and political topics instead of tech adventure. His quick tale, The Sleeper Awakes, though not straight about Atlantis, made tale designs about cutting-edge old societies whose community tries to offer warnings about current-day political growth. Wells's past in community thinking and his worries about factory societies heading shaped his handling of missing society topics, using them as vehicles for looking at questions about tech moving forward, community setup, and the connection between single freedom and group well-being. The coming up of pulp magazines through the early 20th years made fresh markets for Atlantis stories, though making style agreements that focused on doing, adventure, and amazing pictures over book skill or historical rightness. Publications like Amazing Stories, Weird Tales, and Adventure offered regular outlets for tales featuring underwater towns, old tools, and the children of Atlantean survivors living in secret spots around the world. The money pushes of pulp publishing, which asked for quick making and instant reader catching, pushed writers to grow more and more fancy and feeling-based versions of Atlantis topics. Robert E. Howard's Conan tales, starting in the 1930s, worked Atlantis into a full made-up early history that placed the missing continent as the base for all afterward human societies. Howard's Hyborian Age timeline put Atlantis and its sister continent Lemuria as the peaks of the first big round of human society, whose wreckage had thrown survivors over the world to make the different kingdoms and ways of life that made the background for Conan's adventures. This way let Howard pull upon the matching story study and archaeological guessing that marked current-day Atlantis ideas, though making an inside steady made-up setup that might hold stretched tale growth. Howard's showing of the Atlantean community focused on its softness and moral rot, showing both Plato's first topics and current-day worries about current society's heading. The Atlanteans in Howard's tales owned cutting-edge magical and tech abilities, yet had turned weak and spiritually feeble, making them open to the wild strength stood for by people like Conan. This reading fit with Hard Times' age, worries about the link between society skill and cultural strength, offering word-picture setups for grasping current-day community and money tests. The power of theosophical and secret readings of Atlantis became more and more clear in popular books through the middle 20th years, as writers worked in hidden ideas about root races, spiritual growth, and secret masters into adventure and science stories. Writers like A. Merritt and Abraham Merritt grew fancy fantasies featuring Atlantean survivors who had kept old wisdom and magic forces via thousands of years of secret being. These tales usually used current Maine people who found missing Atlantean groups in far-off spots, where they met cutting-edge beings who owned both tech abilities and spiritual knowledge that went past current-day human gains. The after-World War II times saw a big spread in Atlantis-based books as writers dealt with the meanings of atomic weapons, space looking at, and quick tech shift. The atomic wreckage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki offered a current-day match to the disastrous wreckage that had supposedly finished Atlantean society, making Plato's tale appear more fitting and close to current readers. Science story writers started looking at topics about cutting-edge old societies that had wrecked themselves via tech pride, making warning stories that used Atlantis as a word picture for the dangers of wild scientific moving forward. Isaac Asimov's way to Atlantis topics in his Foundation group showed how advanced science story writers might use missing society ideas to look at twisted thoughts about historical rounds, tech growth, and community setup. Though Asimov didn't straight feature Atlantis in his tales, his handling of the dropping of the star-wide empire and the keeping of knowledge via the Foundation matched numerous usual Atlantis topics, though basing them in hard scientific and community guessing. This way shaped afterward science story writers, who looked to make more thinking-wise, advanced handlings of old wisdom and society falling apart. The growth of fantasy books as a clear type through the 1960s and 1970s made fresh chances for fancy Atlantis tales that might look at magical and story topics without the scientific holds that restricted science story handlings. Writers like Lynn Carter, L. Sprague de Camp, and Catherine L. Moore grew wide Atlantis-based fantasy groups that worked in parts from different secret and archaeological ideas, though making first story systems that might hold stretched tale growth. These works usually featured fancy magical setups, twisted political scheming, and detailed world-making that showed Atlantis as a completely thought-out, made-up society, instead of just an unusual adventure background. The coming up of sword and magic stories as a popular smaller type offered extra places for Atlantis-based tales that focused on doing an adventure past twisted plotting or people growth. Writers in this custom, after Howard's model, used Atlantean backgrounds to make scenes using strong fighters, bad magic users, and old treasures that might push quick-moving adventure tales. The formula-like nature of many sword and magic stories caused the growth of standard Atlantis pictures, covering crystal-run tech, fish humans, children of Atlantean survivors, and underwater towns guarded by magical walls. The power of comic books on popular Atlantis pictures turned especially big in making visual agreements that would afterward shape film and television fittings. DC Comics' Aquaman, first showing in 1941, showed Atlantis as a living underwater kingdom whose residents had fitted to sea life, though keeping cutting-edge tech and advanced community setup. The comic book middles focus on visual shows pushed artists to grow more and more fancy showings of Atlantean buildings, tech, and sea life that made lasting marks on popular minds about how the missing society could have looked. Marvel Comics' handling of Atlantis via the person of Namor, the Submariner, gave a more twisted and morally unclear reading that showed current-day worries about nature caring and cultural fight. Namor's job as both hero and bad guy, protecting Atlantean interests toward surface world pushing in, though sometimes threatening innocent humans, offered word picture setups for looking at topics about cultural wrong understanding, nature wreckage, and the costs of tech moving forward. The visual standing for of Atlantis in Marvel Comics focused on its strange and danger-making parts, though keeping enough known parts to stay graspable to readers. The growth of television as a mass middle through the 1950s and 1960s made fresh chances for Atlantis-based fun, though putting on technical and money holds that shaped how the missing society might be shown. Early television makings like Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea featured parts using underwater looking at and old leftovers that pulled upon made Atlantis topics, though fitting them to the restrictions of television making. The want to make convincing underwater parts on restricted money caused the growth of visual methods and design ways that would shape afterward film and television handlings. The 1970s television group, The Man from Atlantis, stood for the first big try to make an ongoing group centered fully on Atlantis topics, featuring Patrick Duffy as the previous survivor of the missing society who owned superhuman swimming abilities and might talk with sea life. The group setup allowed for weekly adventures using underwater looking at old Atlantean tech and fights between Atlantean values and current human community. Even with its fairly quick time, the group made visual and tale agreements for showing Atlanteans as fitted to sea life, though keeping basically human marks and reasons. The power of Disney's moving pictures on popular Atlantis pictures reached its peak with Atlantis, The Lost Empire in 2001, which showed a full vision of Atlantean society that pulled upon tens of years of popular culture growth, though bringing in first parts that would shape afterward handlings. The film's showing of Atlantis as a huge underground whole town run by a puzzling crystal power source worked in parts from different backup archaeology ideas, though making visually amazing parts that showed the possibilities of current moving picture tech for showing fantastic societies. Disney's way to Atlantean tech focused on its working together with natural shapes and steps, showing cutting-edge machines that looked like living things and building buildings that looked to grow naturally from rock shapes. This biomachine look showed current-day interests in nature-friendly sustainable tech, though making special visual marks that told apart Disney's Atlantis from earlier film and television handlings. The film's focus on tongue realness, featuring a built Atlantean tongue created by word expert Mark Okrand, showed the amount of detail that current makings might bring to made-up societies. The coming up of computer-made pictures as a ruling film tech through the 1990s and 2000s changed the possibilities for showing underwater societies and old buildings with unique realness and size. Films like The Abyss and Waterworld showed how digital effects might make convincing underwater settings and huge buildings that would have been not possible to gain via usual filmmaking methods. These tech abilities pushed filmmakers to grow more and more bold Atlantis plans that might show the missing society with visual greatness fitting the size hinted by Plato's first tellings. The power of video games on Atlantis pictures turned more and more big as gaming tech moved forward to hold twisted 3-measurement settings and detailed people modeling. Games like Tomb Raider, Assassin's Creed, and different job-playing games featured wide underwater looking at parts and old leftovers that pulled upon Atlantis visual agreements, though letting players talk straight with these settings. The talking-back nature of gaming made chances for more detailed looking at of Atlantean buildings and tech than quiet media might offer, causing more and more fancy and inside steady showings of the missing society. The growth of hugely many-player online games made lasting virtual worlds that might hold ongoing Atlantis-based content and let thousands of players look at underwater towns and old leftovers together. Games like World of Warcraft and Guild Wars featured wide underwater areas with fancy Atlantis-sparked buildings and story paths that pulled upon different story and popular culture sources. The working together nature of online gaming pushed the growth of detailed background story and steady visual design that might hold stretched players catching Atlantean topics. The power of documentary television programming on popular Atlantis pictures turned especially big in mixing the edges between fun and learning, as makers made programs that showed guessing ideas about the missing society, using the visual agreements and expert tone linked with real historical documentaries. Programs on the History Channel, Discovery Channel, and like systems featured striking remakes of Atlantean society that worked in parts from different backup archaeology ideas, though showing them with making values and tale methods that hinted at school rightness. The Ancient Aliens Happening stood for the peak of this lean toward documentary-style showing of guessing ideas, featuring fancy computer-made remakes of supposed Atlantean tech and buildings that pulled upon tens of years of popular culture growth, though claiming scientific and historical power. These programs' power on the popular mind turned big, making widely passed visual expectations about how Atlantean society should look, boosting backup historical tales that placed the missing continent as proof of old space-being contact or cutting-edge early human abilities. The effect of internet culture on Atlantis' story system made fresh chances for working together growth of backup historical tales, though making it simpler to pass guessing ideas and visual readings. Online groups given to backup archaeology and old puzzles might pass investigation, argue ideas, and grow more and more fancy explanations for different archaeological odd things that worked in Atlantis topics. The equal nature of internet publishing lets single people without usual papers show their ideas to worldwide watchers, though going past the look-over steps that marked school publishing. The coming up of flowing video stages made fresh markets for Atlantis-based content, though shrinking the walls to come in for separate filmmakers and content makers. YouTube paths given to old puzzles might make regular content featuring Atlantis ideas and visual remakes that got to watchers matching usual television, programming though working with tiny money and making holds. This equal making of media making caused a unique growth of Atlantis-linked content that showed diverse cultural views and ideas. The power of current-day nature worries on Atlantis tales became more and more clear as weather shifts and ocean dirtying came up as big worldwide matters. Latest handlings of Atlantis topics often focus on the society's link with sea systems and the natural results of cutting-edge tech, using the missing continent as a word picture for current-day worries about lasting ability and nature wreckage. These readings usually show Atlantean society as either a warning model of nature using or a pattern of lasting tech that the current community should copy. The growth of virtual and added-on truth tools made fresh possibilities for pulling in Atlantis tries that might move users straight into underwater towns and old leftovers with unique realness. VR uses featuring Atlantis looking, It let users swim via detailed 3-measurement rebuilds of the missing society, though talking with its buildings and residents in ways that usual media might not offer. These tools promise to make the most convincing, and catching Atlantis tries ever grown, though raising fresh questions about the link between made-up tales and trying out truth. The worldwide making of popular culture through the late 20th and early 21st hundreds of years made it simpler for Atlantis topics to pass over various national and cultural settings, though pushing the growth of local readings that worked in area story and historical parts. Japanese anime and manga featuring Atlantis topics often focused on the society's link with spiritual and magic forces, though European makings usually focused on archaeological and historical parts of the missing continent. These cultural changes showed how Atlantis topics might be fitted to various tale customs and watcher expectations, though keeping core tale parts that went past cultural edges. The keeping and twisting of Plato's first version via popular culture made twisted links between the thinking source writing and its countless fittings and readings. Though most popular handlings kept basic parts like the island spot, cutting-edge society, and disastrous wreckage, they usually got rid of or changed the moral and political topics that had been main to Plato's first purpose. The focus on adventure, show, and tech wonder in popular fittings showed current-day fun values instead of old thinking worries, making versions of Atlantis that had just shallow likeness to their old-time source, though claiming historical and cultural power. The change of Plato's thinking lesson into a worldwide cultural happening shows basic parts of human mind-working that go past historical times, tech abilities, and cultural edges. The steady draw of Atlantis over the past 2,000 years shows how certain tale setups satisfy deep-set mental wants, though fitting to shifting community situations and thinking setups. Grasping why Atlantis keeps grabbing current watchers' needs, looking at the mental ways that make missing society tales gripping, the ways these tales show current-day worries and hopes, and their link to wider designs of backup historical thinking that test made school power. The basic setup of the Atlantis tale taps into worldwide mental designs that Carl Jung matched as basic parts of the human mind. The tale of a perfect age after by moral dropping and disastrous wreckage fits with story topics found over ways of life, from the Garden of Eden to the Hindu idea of round yugas. These tales offer setups for grasping both single and group tries of missing, failing, and the results of moral picks. The Atlantis tale gives a specially gripping version of this basic design since it mixes the greatness of cutting-edge society with the endness of full wreckage, making a feeling fit that totally unclear moral teachings can't gain. The mental draw of missing wisdom stands for different crucial pieces in Atlantis's lasting popularity. Current single people, taken over by quick tech shifts and the breaking up of knowledge into more and more focused subjects, find comfort in tales that promise full grasping and work together wisdom. The thought that an old society owned full knowledge of natural rules, spiritual basics, and tech uses gives hope that such working together stays thinkable even with current-day thinking breaking up. This draw explains why Atlantis ideas often focus on the society's supposed mastering of both stuff and spiritual areas, showing a pattern of human gain that goes past the thought of restrictions of current focused knowledge. The equal making of knowledge via internet tools has made unique chances for single people to grow and push back historical ideas without usual school papers or group backing. Online groups given to Atlantis investigation might pass facts, plan studies, and grow fancy idea setups that work separately from expert archaeological agreement. These groups often reveal marks of what Richard Hofstadter matched as the worried style in American government working, reading school doubt toward their ideas as proof of planned holding back instead of way hardness. The feeling putting in that takers grow in their backup historical tales makes self-boosting belief setups that turn more and more against standing to opposite proof. Current-day nature worries have deeply shaped current readings of the Atlantis tale, changing it from a story about government and moral rot into a warning tale about tech pride and nature wreckage. Weather shift, ocean dirtying, and life type missing offer current-day matches to the disastrous wreckage that supposedly finished Atlantean society, making Plato's old version appear prophet-like fitting to present worldwide tests. Current Atlantis tales often focus on the society's link with natural strengths and the natural results of cutting-edge tech, showing current-day worries about lasting ability and the long-time workability of factory society. The showing of Atlantean tech in current-day popular culture shows big worries about the link between tech moving forward and human well-being. Different from Victorian time readings that honored tech moving forward as perfect progress, current handlings often show Atlantean tech as both amazing and danger-making, able to make unique wealth though threatening society's survival. This unclear feeling shows current-day tries with atomic weapons, gene building, fake smartness, and different strong tools that promise both huge help and being-level dangers. The Atlantis tale offers a setup for looking at these tech worries via the safe gap of old history. The hunt for backup explanations of human gain stands for different big pieces in Atlantis's current-day draw, especially between single people who feel cut off from main school and scientific groups. The thought that old societies owned abilities going past those of current community tests regular tales about human moving forward, though giving hope that present restrictions could be gone past via the getting back of missing knowledge. This draw explains the steady popularity of ideas about old space people, cutting-edge early societies, and held-back archaeological finds that supposedly show humanity's forgotten chance. The link between Atlantis trust and wider designs of fake archaeological thinking shows planned ways to prove judgment that put feeling satisfaction over hardness. Fake archaeological ideas usually start with wanted endings about human history or abilities, afterwards selectively gathering proof that looks to back these endings though pushing away opposite facts as the outcome of school bias or plot. This way makes inside steady belief setups that might fit virtually any fresh facts, though keeping their core guesses about old societies and secret knowledge. The visual culture around Atlantis has grown to work in more and more advanced computer-made pictures and virtual truth tools that might make convincing showings of underwater towns and old buildings. These visual standings for often turn more powerful than word-based tellings, informing popular expectations about how Atlantean society should look, making feedback circles where fresh ideas need to fit made visual agreements to receive acceptance. The passing of detailed Atlantis pictures over many media stages has made a past visual wordbook that makes the missing society appear known and real, even with the missing of archaeological proof. The business-making of Atlantis topics via travel places, fun, and backup learning markets has made money pushes for pushing guessing ideas no matter of their school worth. Travel spots claiming links to Atlantean society, documentary programs featuring striking remakes of the missing continent, and books promising to show old secrets all help money-wise from keeping public interest in backup historical tales. These business pushes often push more and more feeling-based claims and fancy plot ideas that might grab public focus in fighting fun markets. The worldwide making of Atlantis story system has made it simpler to fit to diverse cultural settings, though keeping core tale parts that go past local customs. Japanese readings often focus on spiritual and magic parts of Atlantean society, though European handlings usually focus on archaeological and historical measurements. American versions often work in topics about single finding and tech mastering that show special cultural values. These changes show how bendable story setups might be fitted to various cultural settings, though working like mental jobs over diverse populations. The learning meanings of wide-ranging Atlantis trust show big tests for science learning and hard-thinking teaching. Students who have taken in backup historical tales via popular media often come to formal learning with earlier thought ideas about old societies that fight with archaeological proof and scientific ways. Teachers need to deal with these wrong ideas, though explaining why expert standards of proof judging are needed for telling apart trustworthy knowledge from guessing. The popularity of backup historical tales points up the want for better science talking and media reading learning that might help single people judge fighting claims about the earlier time. The staying of Atlantis ideas, even with steady failing to make archaeological proof, shows important understandings about the link between trust setups and real-world study. The missing of physical leftovers from any cutting-edge Atlantic society through the times put forward by different ideas hasn't shrunk popular interest in the missing continent yet, has rather pushed more and more fancy explanations for why such proof stays secret or not known. These explanations often use claims about ruling body cover-ups, school plots, or the not enoughness of regular archaeological ways, making not provable belief setups that might keep themselves forever no matter of real-world findings. The comfort-giving jobs of Atlantis tales for single people fighting with feelings of cutting off, meaning missingness, or power missingness in the current community deserve knowing alongside their more trouble-making parts. Trust in old wisdom and missing societies might offer comfort, purpose, and group for humans who feel not linked from main cultural groups. The feeling of extra knowledge and secret truth that goes with backup historical trusts might give mental help that aids single people deal with personal tests and community not-surenesses. Grasping these comfort-giving jobs is crucial for growing working ways to science learning that no feeling wants though pushing hard-thinking abilities. The coming time growth of Atlantis story system will probably keep showing shifting tech abilities, nature worries, and community worries, though keeping the core tale parts that have held its draw for the past 2,000 years. Virtual and added-on truth tools promise to make more and more pulling in Atlantis tries that might mix the edges between made-up fun and historical learning. Moves forward in underwater looking at and archaeological looking methods will keep offering fresh settings for Atlantis guessing, though at the same time showing the missing of proof for any cutting-edge Atlantic society through put forward times. The job of Atlantis as a cultural touchstone for talks about human chance, tech moving forward, and society lasting ability makes sure it's kept fitting no matter of archaeological finds or school agreement. The tale works as a bendable word picture setup that might fit diverse readings and uses though keeping feeling fit over various historical times and cultural settings. This fitting ability explains why Atlantis has lived through the truth-losing of exact ideas and will probably keep growing in answer to coming time community and tech growths. The hard judging of Atlantis claims offers valuable chances for growing and showing scientific ways, archaeological thinking, and historical checking. The steady popularity of backup ideas about the missing society makes ongoing teaching times where teachers might reveal the tellings apart between guessing and proof-based endings, though explaining why expert standards of look over and do again results are needed for moving forward human knowledge. The Atlantis happening thus works for learning purposes that go way past its exact historical claims to cover wider questions about how we tell apart trustworthy knowledge from wanting it thinking. The lasting legacy of Plato's Atlantis finally goes past questions about its historical rightness to cover basic matters about human nature, community setup, and the link between progress and moral growth. If read as a thinking lesson, historical version, or current story system, the Atlantis tale keeps offering setups for looking at these forever questions, though fitting to current-day situations and worries. Its staying over diverse cultural settings and historical times shows the strength of well-made tales to grab human thinking and offer meaning in ways that totally fact-based versions can't gain. The happening of Atlantis shows both the powers and restrictions of human design-looking behavior, revealing how the identical mind steps that make possible scientific finding and cultural making new might also make fancy wrong ideas and against-standing belief setups. Grasping why Atlantis stays in human thinking needs knowing both its good jobs as a source of wonder, spark-making, and group, and its trouble-making parts as a vehicle for fake scientific thinking and plot ideas. This matched view gives the best base for loving the cultural meaning of Plato's lasting making, though keeping hard-thinking abilities needed for telling apart between gripping tales and trustworthy historical knowledge. As humanity faces unique worldwide tests needing both tech-making new and wisdom about the results of our picks, the Atlantis tale stays fitting as a warning story about the link between strength and duty. If the missing society was as Plato told, worked as word picture for government rotting, or jobs as current story system about human chance, Its middle message about the dangers of moral dropping and the breakableness of society gain speaks straight to current-day worries about lasting ability, fairness, and the coming time of human society. In this meaning, Atlantis keeps working its first purpose as a teaching tool for grasping the forever tests of human community, making sure it has a spot in human thinking for times to come.